All right, we're past the designated time. I'm going to call the meeting to order. Excuse me, if I could ask everyone to take their seats, please. Members of the public are advised that our meetings are webcast live by the City of Hamilton and temporarily archived on the city's website. Other individuals and the media may also be audibly and or visually recording this meeting. As well, a reminder that all electronic devices are to be switched to a non-audible function. And at this point in time, I'm going to turn to the clerk. Madam Clerk, are there any changes to the agenda this morning?
Yes, there are added staff presentation for item 8.1 is before you. That's respecting the 2019 Development Charges Background Study Summary. There are added registered speakers for today's public meeting respecting the Development Charges Background Study for the 9:30 a.m. session. Added speaker 8.1 AD Sergio Mancha from Urban Solutions Planning and Land Development Consultants Incorporated. Additionally, Robert Graham from Redeemer University College. The presentation and handout is before you, and Dan Pottsmith's presentation is before you. For the 7 p.m. session, added items 8.1 BB, Nafia Al Mutwali, Microgrid Solutions, 8.1 BC, Stephanie Petroli and Scott Robinson, McMaster Students Union, 8.1 BD, Savan Chandra, Tibero Group, and 8.1 BE, Karen Dearness. There are also added written submissions from Mike Cope, McMaster Students Union, Joel Farber from Folger Rubinoff LLP, Carl Gonson, Metropolitan Consulting Incorporated, T. Johns Consulting Group Limited, and the Hamilton Halton Home Builders Association. Additionally, for staff presentation, item 9.1, the tax and rate operating budget variance report as at December 31st, 2018. There is some revised wording to page 2 of the report, and on page 17 and 18 of the PowerPoint presentation, there were some changes, and that is before you as well.
Thanks, Madam Clerk. I need a motion from committee to approve the agenda as amended, moved by Pearson, seconded by Partridge, and that is an electronic vote. All those in favor, please. Carries, thank you. Declarations of interest this morning. Hearing none, I'm going to move on to the approval of the minutes from a previous meeting, and it is from the April 4th meeting, moved by Vanderbeek, seconded by Johnson. All those in favor is electronic vote. Carries, thank you. We're on to consent items 7.1a through 7.1f. They're minutes from various advisory committee meetings. Well, I'll go through the list. Anything to pull from here, and then we'll just move them en masse if there are no questions. Questions or comments on any of those? Moved by Vanderbeek, seconded by Pearson then. All those in favor? And are those all to receive then, Madam Clerk? Yep, so we're good that way. Carries, thank you. Then on to 8.1 is the 2019 Development Charges Background Study and Bylaw Update. Sorry, Madam Clerk.
Just items 7.2 through 7.4.
Oh, I was going to do them, I was saying mover and seconder for all those. No problem. Yep. So on 8.1 then, members of the committee, is a public meeting pursuant to Section 12 of the Development Charges Act 1997 to present and obtain public input on the city's proposed 219 Development Charges Bylaw and the respective underlying background study, as well as proposed amendments to Development Charges Exemption Policy contained within the city's GO Transit Development Charges Bylaw 11-174 and the respective underlying background study. Notice of this public meeting was published in the Hamilton Spectator on March the 22nd, 2019, and the Hamilton Community News on March 21st, 2019, inviting interested parties to make representation at today's meeting. Also, any person in attendance can make representation. The public meeting will be held using the following procedure. And as you know, the committee will hear a presentation from Gary Scanlon from Watson and Associates with respect to the 219 Development Charges Background Study. Following the presentation, registered delegates will be invited to the podium. At the conclusion of the registered speakers list and those who were called to the podium, anyone else wishing to address the issue will be invited to speak. Following the final speaker, the public meeting will recess until 7 p.m. for this evening's session when we have additional speakers lined up to speak. Prior to receiving the delegations, I'll now ask Gary Scanlon from Watson & Associates to come to the podium to provide a presentation on the 2019 Development Charges Background Study. Gary, I'll call you at this time.
I need a high chair. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you.
Morning, Gary.
Good morning. Sorry, Mr. Chair, for being
That's all right.
a little bit slow.
Floor's yours.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be before committee again. I'm going to cover several different topics, really recapping what we've talked about over the course of a year. Talk about the process, which is important. Part of it is mandated under the Development Charges Act. Part of it is part of Hamilton's historic policy of engaging with the public. We'll talk about the schedule from this point forward, and then I'll summarize various components of the development charge and the rates and the policies that are contained therein. As I've noted, the process to date, we started over a year ago, March 1st, 2018. We had with the stakeholder subcommittee, and since that time, we've had in total about six different meetings. We've gone through to talk about historic policies, exemption policies, calculations, projects, et cetera. We released the detailed project listing in the beginning of January, so there's been ample opportunity to receive feedback from both the committee members and generally from the public. Background study was released, so we formalized all of the discussions and such into that background study. It's a fairly sizable document. And that was released on March 13th. Now, it's important the dates that it's released because with updated changes to the Act, which occurred as of January 1st, 2016, when we released the background study, that starts the time clock. Council cannot consider the bylaw within 60 days of the release of that document. So you can see that we released it in March, and then subsequently we'll be back before council either towards the end of May or early June. So we're outside of the 60-day mandatory period. We've provided a number of public notices, so it's been well communicated. There have been meetings of staff with various members of the community, SEPA developers in the downtown, McMaster, Ag Society, Mohawk, Affordable Housing Group. And then we've received a variety of communication thus far, I think from approximately 14, 15 different either agencies or groups have provided submissions. And the questions have been, across the whole gamut of the background study. Methodology, policies, more clarity on policies, more clarity on the projects, et cetera. So this is the schedule moving from this point forward, and as I've noted, we released the document on March the 13th. We have the public meeting today. So it's a minimum, once you release the background study, there's a minimum 2 weeks before you can have the public meeting, so we're well within that period as well. You can see that council consideration of the bylaw is either May the 6th, there's discussions at either May the 16th or June the 6th, and then council's consideration May the 22nd or June the 12th. Obviously, with the input that we received today, we want an opportunity to consider that and to bring it back for council's further consideration. Once that's done, it starts a subsequent process where there's notice, you put it in the newspaper, the school boards have to be advised as well, and then there's a 40-day appeal period. After that, then we publish the pamphlet. So that's just summarizing the Act fairly quickly on the process. When we take a look at development charges, they're full cost recovery calculations that we do. So there's a number of reductions, deductions, limitations that the Development Charges Act sets out, and we respect all of those, and those are documented in our report. And then subsequent to that, council can make further exemptions. Any of these reductions and deductions are, because we're looking at projects and we're looking at financing these projects, when you provide an exemption, it means it's a loss of revenue against those individual projects, which is fine. That just means that council then has to make up the difference through either property taxes or your water and wastewater rates. So there's a direct I'm not going to recover it from this class of taxpayer, the new growth. I'm going to collect it from the existing taxpayers or ratepayers. The study components, just quickly, they've got the current policies that are there in the City of Hamilton, exemption policies and timing policies for collection. There are some refinements that have been made. These have been discussed thoroughly with this committee, and we have your direction, and we've incorporated those policies. The development within the city, for the most part, is considering grids and then subsequent amendments to your official plan, and they've been incorporated, and they're the basis for looking at the projects. The calculation is provided. Different types of housing the charges are stratified on low, medium, and high-density housing, and then on non-residential development. Various policies, et cetera. One I'd like to highlight is the local service policy. This is a change that the Act provided, the ministry provided January 1st, 2016. You have had a local service policy. Local services under the Act is those very localized expenditures. For a subdivision, it'd be the internal water mains, the internal sewers, the sidewalks, streetlights, et cetera. So the Act has been modified a little bit to basically say that we have to be more express. We must communicate a little clearer what the expectations are for the developer to pay for those particular services, and normally they're 100% borne by the developer, and then clarity as to what we've included within the development charge. So we've included that local service policy. We've got, as part of our team, I haven't mentioned, but we've got Dillon Consulting, who's helped us out on transportation and on transit. We have GM Blue Plan that's helped us on water and wastewater, and we have Woods, who's helped us with the stormwater. So they've also inputted into those local services policies so that we have a very, we think we've quite expressed clearly the intent of the city in those manners. The Act talks about summarizing the expenditures over the next 5 years. So there's a sizable amount of expenditures being made. You can see about $2.8 million in anticipated expenditures. There's a number of, as I say, reductions and deductions, which bring us down to about almost $1.3 million that we'll recover through the development charges that we've calculated. Now, these are before we've done further exemptions from growth. So any of those additional exemption policies will reduce that 1.3 million downwards. One item that I would note is there's, you can see the $134,000, 135, talks about post-period. That is growth related, but those are, when we update the bylaw in 5 years, some of those costs will be pulled in to the calculation. So not all of this is funded directly by water and sewer. That 135 will have to be cash flowed, but it will be recoverable at some point into the future. When we take a look at the charges, there are urban charges, so that's your water, wastewater, and storm. We have broken that. We've had conversations with council over time to talk about differentiating some of the charges, and we have differentiated the charges for stormwater purposes. So the combined sewer system, for the most part, I think is from Fennel Avenue and north, and then the rest of the mountain and out into Stony Creek and such would be the separated sewer system area. So we've differentiated the charges. You can see for a single detached unit, you would pay $18,000 within the combined sewer service area. You'd pay $27,000 for the separated sewer area. You can see on the very last column the difference on the non-residential cost per square foot. Citywide, the 13-year represents the harder services such as roads, and then police and fire are included in there. And we've got a $12,500 charge for that for single. And then the 10-year services, which are basically parks, recreation, library, paramedics, those are shorter term planning horizon services that we use. We're mandated to only look over a 10-year planning horizon. That's $12,800. We total them all up, and the charge within the combined sewer service area for a single detached unit would be just over $43,000, and for a separated sewer area, basically the mountain, and then into the east and west areas, about approaching $53,000. This just breaks down those charges in a little bit more detail by types of unit. So moving from the left to the right, the size of the unit gets smaller and smaller. So your largest are single and semi-detached. The medium density are townhouses. And then we have two categories of apartment. And then we have a smaller residential facility, which is, for the most part, trying to facilitate maybe the seniors' housing. So we've provided that on a very nominal person per unit charge. So you can see it goes from that 43,000, 53,000 down as low as $14,000 to $16,000. The middle part just talks about the existing rate in effect currently for those charges. So you can see our existing rate is imposed equally across all the urban area. It's $38,000, and it will be increasing to somewhere between $43,000 and $52,000. The corresponding increase is reflected there for the single detached. And then correspondingly for each of the size of the units, we've expressed that going from, once again, from left to right on those columns. Non-residential, you can see that the charge ranges from, for urban service, from $18 to $20. The industrial, we've continued the 39% reduction. So we have $11 to $12 charge for industrial. And you can see the existing rates, and then in red, we've noted that basically the charges that we've calculated are being reduced from where they are currently. Quite often, we look at how our charges are compared to our neighbors and to some other municipalities of comparable size and variety of services. You can see right now the City of Toronto has a charge of about almost $61,000 if you were looking at a single detached unit in Toronto. Burlington's running at about $49,000 currently, but City of Burlington is modifying their development charge, so on that very right-hand column there's actually an increase that's being proposed, so they'd be looking at almost $56,000. Lincoln and Niagara Region recently adopted their bylaws over the last year. They're running at about $39,000, and you can see the gray area is our current charges versus the proposed calculated charges, which is on the extreme right-hand side. And as we go down, you can see the comparable municipalities running generally in the $30,000 range, but then we get into some of the municipalities such as Brantford, which are in the $20,000 range, and then London outside the growth area, which is basically $18,000. This is the non-residential charge, so a similar type of comparison. You can see we're in the middle of the range currently, and the largest being Burlington area, running at about $48 per square foot, proposed to increase slightly to $49 per square foot. Similar type of presentation for industrial, and a similar type of positioning where the charges that are presented are basically in the midpoint of those comparators. This is just to demonstrate, and what's difficult sometimes when we're looking at the development charge is that some municipalities provide different services than what you may do. You're a full service municipality, and with the calculations, for the most part, we've included everything on this list with the exception of cemeteries. So the Hamilton list of services is on the left-hand side. As you move across, any of the areas that have been grayed out, they don't provide that service. So Oakville, Milton, Burlington, Halton Hills, Lincoln, etc., don't provide cemeteries. Some do, such as Waterloo and Kitchener. And I'll just leave that for your consideration. so that the, looking at the bottom rows, the third to last row just gives the actual charge that's being imposed in those municipalities currently. And then as we step down, the services Hamilton doesn't provide have been netted out in order to compare them to those municipalities. So you can see if we net out a number of them, that we're down at about 39,000, and the corresponding charges are there. And then Hamilton's DC charge if you're collecting like services. I'll leave that for your information. Excuse me. So as I've noted, they are, we've calculated full recovery charges based on what's set out in the Act. From that point, then, you start to provide for potential reductions or deductions where you're not going to collect. So you're different types of exemptions depending on certain types of development. The Act mandates certain exemptions. They're not extensive, but for the most part, there's some level of intensification in there. So for industrial buildings, if you have an existing industrial building, you can expand it by up to 50% and no charge is payable. So if I got a 100,000 square foot building, I can expand that building to up to 150,000 square feet and I wouldn't pay a charge. If I expand it up to 175, then I would be paying for that incremental 25% that's exceeding the 50% exemption. For the local government sector, so charges that you create, you cannot impose onto the school boards. If you're in Halton region that have upper and lower tiers, the upper and lower tiers can't impose it on themselves or the school boards. So there's an exemption where the school board won't impose the charge on you for any of your buildings, and you won't impose a charge when they build a school or another facility. If you have an existing single-family home, you can create up to 2 additional units in that building, and a charge would not be imposed as long as you don't double the size of the building. If I have 1,000 square feet and I add 2 600-square-foot apartments, now I'm exceeding the size of it. Those apartments would then be eligible for payment. Currently, so I'm going to go through now the various exemptions that are included in the in our background study. Once again, these have been discussed at great length with committee members, and we've incorporated the direction of the committee. The mandatory, so these are full exemptions. So in these particular instances, no charge would be imposed. So a building that's basically used for parking. If you have parking associated with any of the buildings, then the parking for that facility, commercial or residential, would not pay. But if you're building a commercial parking structure for just revenue use, you would pay. Agricultural uses, so bona fide farms would be exempt, places of worship, a laneway house, and then temporary buildings or structure are fully exempt from the charges. Within the downtown SEPA area, there's exemptions for the Class A office development, so it'll be 70% of the charge would be exempted. For all other developments within this area, there'll be a staged reduction. Currently, the exemption is 60%. So you'll only pay 40% of the charge. So we've continued that for till 2020. And then as you can see, we're staging it down by 10% for 2020 to 21, and then once again from 21 to 22. And then we'll hold at that level for the residual of the bylaw life. Partial exemptions are also within other SEPA or BIA areas. 50% reduction for the first 5,000 square feet of these non-industrial buildings. Then the next 5,000 square feet, you would pay 75% of the development charge, and then full charges once you exceed 10,000 square feet. Student residences developed by university, college, or applied arts would receive a 50% exemption from the charge payable. and that will be in effect to the June 30th, 2020, after which the full charge is in place. Thank you. Excuse me. Redevelopment of existing residential development for creating more residential facilities within the building envelope. Then you'd receive 50% for the additional units, 50% reduction, and then adapted reuse for portions of the protected heritage properties would be exempted from the development charge as well. That reaches the end of my presentation, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to summarize that after this, we will be receiving further commentary is to be directed. We've got a website set up specifically for this, so any additional commentary can be sent to us, and staff will be receiving that. And then depending on how much and how long it takes staff and ourselves to review those comments, we'll be back before committee and council towards the end of May or the middle of June.
Sounds good, Gary, and I do have a couple of questions from committee. First on the list is Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm on the Development Charges Stakeholder Committee, so I've been privileged to see this presentation a number of times. So, Gary, I just want to clarify something because I've been reading some of the correspondence that is coming in, and I just want to clarify something that's been written in here. So one of the letters that came in said that we are exempting all development charges in the rural area.
No, that's
Right,
not correct.
thank you.
It's
So-
bona farms
Right.
those are the uses we're targeting.
Right, so it's agriculturally use only.
That's correct.
So it's a pole barn, or it could be a silo, or something that's related to agriculture. It's not residential, it's not business. Everything else is billed accordingly, as everyone across the city is.
That's correct.
Thank you. So I just want to clarify that very quickly and get that out in the road, because I don't want that rumor spreading around, because then I'll have lots of rural people asking me why they're getting charged. So thank you very much for clarifying.
Yeah, I'm not on the Development Charges Subcommittee, so I'm brand new at this, on a steep learning curve. But my office is getting a lot of calls through you, Mr. Chairman, from educational facilities arguing adding a new development charge for academic facilities. First of all, is that correct? And second of all, is that just for new residences within the universities and colleges, or is that also for the academic buildings?
So in the what's proposed is to eliminate the exemption for the student housing, the residential units, so that they will pay. This is very similar to most other municipalities. If you go over to Waterloo, there's a charge for student residences, for Laurier University or, Laurier and Waterloo University.
So you're not looking at exempting or taking away the exemption for academic buildings, lecture halls, training centers. It's just the residences that are on those particular developments. Is that correct?
So let's just go back. The discussion that we were having was to eliminate the reduction for the universities. So the student housing here would be exempt to the end of the year. I have to I haven't got my book in front of me, so I can't
Refer to staff on this one. Gary, Cindy, you want to help us out with?
Sure, through the chair. We are looking at removing the academic exemption that was discussed at the DC Stakeholder Committee and was approved to remove the academic exemption.
So it's more than just the residences, as was implied here. It also includes lecture halls and new academic training care centers.
Through the chair, yes, when we're looking at academic exemption, it includes those components. With regards to student residences, we are looking at a 50% exemption reduction up until June 2020.
Okay, so was student residences subject to development charges before? Cindy?
Through the chair, student residences were charged 50%.
Okay, and now you're looking to take them to 100, and the academic portion of a and McMaster, Redeemer, Mohawk would also be charged development charges.
So through the chair, if under the act, for example, Mohawk College is a Crown agency, so it will not be paying development charges, where some academic facilities are not Crown agencies, and they would be subject to development charges.
Is Redeemer a Crown agency?
Through the chair, Redeemer is not a Crown agency.
Is McMaster?
Through the chair, McMaster is not a Crown agency.
Interesting. You know what, it seems like there's a little bit of just, there's not fair play here amongst the, it's either all in or all out, but that's not the case. Mohawk is out, they're exempt, but Master and Redeemer you're proposing are in. Have I got that correct?
Through the chair, it is based on what is defined as a Crown agency, so those decisions were made a number of years ago. We are just required to comply. If you are a Crown agent, you are not subject to development charges.
Who determines if it's a Crown agent? Is that the feds or the province?
Through the chair, it's an act of legislation. It's the province that makes that determination.
Okay. Well, I think this is going to be controversial based on the calls I've had and requests for meetings from Redeemer and McMaster on this issue, and I think we got some delegations coming in. So I guess this committee can manage that differently if we so choose. I don't know who to direct that question to. I guess I'll go to you, Cindy, because you've been answering all the questions, or Brian or Mike.
Through the chair, the recommendations that are before this committee and will ultimately before council, we are in the hands of council as it relates to amending those. I'll just remind this committee, as I will remind council, if you increase exemptions, you will in effect have to increase water and sewer rates and the levy, because any increase in exemptions must be offset by existing ratepayers and taxpayers. So as you go through the process on deliberating potential amendments to the recommendations and the exemptions, I would just ask that you inquire with staff what the offsetting increase to water and sewer rates and taxes will be to affect that change in the exemptions.
Okay, thanks, Mike, for pointing that out to us. It just seems like there's some inequities when if you're a Crown agency, you're exempt, and I don't know who did that or when they did it or whether they can do it now, but that'll come out, I suspect, in the presentations. And a comparison to other municipalities, because it was interesting when you did your presentation, you showed how we compare to other municipalities. I didn't see one on academic institutions, who's in and who's out. I've seen letters from those agencies saying, hey, we're an anomaly, you're trying to put this in place. So through you, Mr. Chairman, are we an anomaly? Is most cities not charge development charges for academic facilities?
It ranges. I know that, I think historically Ottawa had two OMB cases where they took the province for the colleges to the OMB, and they took the university. And so that they were not allowed to impose the charge on the college, but they were allowed to impose the charge on the university. So it depends on the individual municipality. I think some of them are at 50%. I know we had a long discussion in Guelph. Initially, they were proposing to not exempt them, and then they've chosen to exempt them for most of the services.
Okay, I appreciate that. And we'll follow up on this further, Mr. Chairman, as we hear the delegations, because I think Redeemer and Matt are both coming in, and we'll probably have comparison charts for us to look at. Last question is, development charge exemptions. In Ancaster, I'm seeing a lot of rebuilds happening. We have large lots with small homes because they once had septic tanks. So when someone demolishes a home and puts a new one up, a more modern home, are they exempt from DCs?
Yes.
Both rural and urban?
Yes. If you, within time horizon, normally you've got up to about 5 years to replace a building, and that would apply on.
Demolished.
Yep. And if you're doing intensification, and if I knock 3 single-family homes down and build 10 townhouses, you'd pay the 10 times the townhouse rate, subtract 3 times the single family. So it's been there since the 1990s.
I don't see much of a problem with lots staying vacant for 5 years because we have the missing tooth rule where you've got to take out a building permit before you get a demolition permit in order to encourage rebuild quick. So you're not, leaving a hole, if you will,
Right.
in that particular streetscape. Those are my questions for now, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Councillor. Councillor Vanderbeek, you're next.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So through you, and I don't know if you can answer this at this point, but I guess I'm looking at a logistics question, which is if one of the universities has complete applications underway, ordinarily DCs, as I understand it, don't come up until they actually get their building permit. So what happens if they have a complete application today and their building permit can't be issued until after this goes into effect? Are they grandfathered at the old DC situation, or are they now under the new rules?
That's a great question. It always, it's always there. You know, when we're trying to update a bylaw, generally municipalities follow a process where if they have a completed building permit application, then they would allow that to proceed under the older bylaw. But if I just get an application but there's nothing behind it, then it's not a complete application. So that one would probably be subject to the new charge. So normal course is if you've got all your information in and staff are just taking the time to process it, you would be subject to the former bylaw charges.
Okay, so thank you for that, but I think that's a step ahead of where I was, where they put in an application for a project, so they'll have planning application maybe and maybe a site plan. It may only be a site plan. If they've started that project, they haven't applied for the building permit.
Okay.
So what happens about this project they've got underway, the planning are working through the process with, when it comes to the point where they have to pay their development charges? They've started the process before this is enacted and the new bylaw is enacted, and they're finishing it under the new bylaw because you can't get it done quicker. I just wondered what happens with their DCs. Do they fall under the old? Are they grandfathered into the old DCs, which they would have budgeted for and planned on, or are they now going to be having to pay the new ones?
So I apologize for misunderstanding
I
the
didn't
question.
ask the question properly.
Yeah, because I was referring to the building permit process, but if somebody's started a process, it's just like a developer putting in a subdivision. You've got an approved subdivision, but they haven't pulled the building permit. Just because you have the subdivision does not lock you in, grandfather you to the old rates. It's only generally the building permit, which is the trigger for which bylaw am I paying under. If you started a project, but it could take a year, it could take 5 years to complete that, depending on where you're at in having all the documents put into place. The trigger is the building permit, not the project.
So whenever the building permit is applied for, that's when you decide which bylaw you fall under.
That's correct.
Thank you. I appreciate that clarification.
Thanks, Councillor Vanderbeek. And I did have myself next on the list. If I could ask Councillor to take the chair. Thank you, Councillor. And if I could, through you, Madam Chairman, Gary, what prevents the city from offering a grant in lieu of a development charge? And so it might be maybe a better question for our staff, because we have a long history of supporting some of the local hospitals with their capital campaigns. And of course, across the street, we have the health building that was constructed in partnership with McMaster, and we were a contributor to that. I think it was a $10 million donation. 20, okay, I stand corrected. And so I wondered along the same lines, is there an opportunity if we went with the complete, if we applied to DCs to both the academic and the residential portion of the education institutions, is there an opportunity for the city to weigh in on individual projects with grants in lieu of DCs, thereby providing a subsidy, and it gives the city then some discretion in terms of the level of its contribution rather than it being a hardline percentage?
Excellent question. There are a number of municipalities, that's how they handle, instead of doing exemptions, they develop a grant program. That way, when we're trying to generate an exemption and define it within a bylaw, you're trying to put all the words to it and try and get council's vision within that bylaw. There's always variations that, make it very unique. Handling it outside the bylaw and doing a grant to either 100% or some portion of it makes it a lot easier for council to consider it, and it's on an ad hoc basis, and it really will reflect council's vision for that particular type of development, that particular situation. So I know Niagara Region has a number of different grant programs. They've got, if you take a look at the bylaw, they have an industrial charge, but they have an industrial grant so that, you apply and then you get the grant equal to some portion of the development charge.
Okay, so others then apply it through you, Madam Chairman. They apply it to other classes as well. It's beyond the education.
That's correct.
Okay, interesting. Okay, those are my questions. Madam Chair, I'll take the chair back, go on to the speaker, and I have Councilors Partridge and Clark.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And Gary, thank you for your presentation and your firm's work on this with staff. I have a couple of quick questions. Could you go to slide 17, please? There we go. So the very first one says a building or part thereof used for parking, but excluding a building or part thereof used for commercial parking. So I get the second part, I'm assuming would be a high-rise condo apartment building that had commercial on the ground floor and parking underground or within that building. That would be excluded from the exemptions, is that correct?
That's correct. What we're trying to attain through this policy is to say, if you've got a commercial building and you've got underground parking, you need to provide parking for that building. So the underground parking should be exempt, because if I've got the same type of building out in a business park, you're not charging for the the ground level parking. But if we come into the downtown, you got the same square footage, the same type of building, but now you're providing the parking underneath for the employees. It would be inequitable to charge them for the same parking just because it's tight. So what this is trying to do is put them on an even footing. But if you build a four-story solely commercial for revenue purposes, a structure, then you would not be exempted because it's a revenue-generating structure.
Okay, I appreciate that clarification. And so a building or part thereof used for parking. Stopping there, can you give an example of that? A building or part thereof used for parking, but excluding a building or part thereof used for commercial parking. So
That's what I'm trying, yeah.
So that's the four-story you were referring to?
Yes, if I build a two-story, three-story, four-story, pure revenue-generating complex, it's a commercial entity, you would pay the charge. But if I have underground parking for, an office complex, we wouldn't charge them because they need the associated parking.
Okay, thank you. And the next one, Chair, if you skip down to a place of worship. So the place of worship excluded, does that include a place of worship within a school or a university or college? And I'm thinking of Redeemer, I'm thinking of McMaster Divinity, or even some of the Christian schools and Catholic schools where they actually have a place of worship right inside them. So how would that formula work?
I didn't carry the big document over here, so referring to the bylaw gives you the specifics, but we're trying to target the area which would be used for the worshiping. There's a lot of, what we find is some of these buildings now are having schools built associated with them so that they have Montessori or whatever. You have rental complexes, so, for weddings and stuff, so they're revenue generating. So they're starting to be, and you have residences there, perhaps for the minister or whatever. So we're targeting the area of where the worship takes place in order to be exempted, but these other uses potentially would not be. Just because they're attached to the building does not make them exempt.
And I appreciate that explanation. There was some confusion for me. And Chair, my last one is, the last bullet is a temporary building or structure. Does that include a temporary farm help house?
I haven't got the bylaw.
I know you don't have the huge book with you, but
Perhaps.
that is an ongoing issue certainly in my area, in Ward 15 in Flamborough, where, there have been some farm help houses built and allowed, and then others where they have not.
I'll turn to staff on that one if you don't mind.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Lindsay or Cindy, do you have, Lindsay?
Through the chair, so a temporary building in our bylaw means a non-residential building without a foundation which is constructed, erected, or placed on land for a continuous time period not exceeding 1 year.
So without a foundation
Without a foundation and a non-residential.
and a non-residential, okay. So that in my mind, because the temporary farm help houses do not have a foundation, but you do have temporary workers working in them who are seasonal, such as our migrant workers. So would that be exempt?
Through the chair, if that structure is in place for more than 1 year, then no.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate the answers.
Councillor Clark.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I heard about the Crown Agency with regards to colleges. I think that's pretty much historical. Didn't that go back to Bill Davis' days, when he actually created the colleges to begin with? So it's really not within our bailiwick no matter what. It's a provincial issue whether they choose to extend Crown agencies to universities or other schools. That's their call, not ours, correct?
Through the chair, that's correct.
Can you enlighten all of us the term heads and beds in lieu of taxes? What exactly are we talking about there? Because for the average citizen out there, heads and beds in lieu of taxes is incredibly confusing.
So through the chair, I appreciate the question. There are certain properties within the city that are not levied in the same way as other properties. So they are not levied based on their assessment, their current value assessment. They are levied a payment in lieu of assessment, and one of those payments in lieu is what is referred to as heads and beds. Heads and beds apply to colleges, universities, and hospitals. And the fee or rate is, it was set in 1987, and it hasn't been adjusted since 1987. It's $75 per full-time student and per hospital bed. And again, it's levied on most, all post-secondary institutions. Any private institutions are not levied heads and beds, and that predates, that goes back to 1998. While there was a legislative change post-1998, there are some post-secondary private institutions who do not pay property taxes based on assessment, nor do they pay heads and beds.
Are there any of those in Hamilton?
Through the chair, Redeemer is an institution that does not pay heads and beds and is not levied based on assessment.
Do they pay any property taxes to the municipality? What?
Through the chair, no.
Interesting. They're the only one?
Through the chair, yes.
Interesting.
And sorry, through the chair, just to expand on that, we do have some private institutions like Columbia College, and they pay property taxes based on assessment. So they do not pay heads and beds because they are privately operated. So they pay based on assessed value.
And would they pay DCs?
Through the chair, yes, they are not exempt.
Redeemer would be exempt from DCs on the current program.
Through the chair, they would be subject to any amendments that are before committee today.
Can the city of Hamilton, Mr. Chairman, apply an inflation rate to pills or payments in lieu or heads and beds?
So through the chair, this has been an ongoing dialogue with the province. Previous city councils have put forward resolutions, other municipalities have put forward resolutions on a number of options and as it relates to moving that yardstick of $75, recognizing that in over 30 years, that $75 has not been adjusted. I think we did a calculation, if it was based on 2018 dollars, that $75 equates to just over $30.
$39.13.
$39 if you were to adjust it for inflation. So again, previous councils have put forward resolutions on a range of options. One would be to inflate, to set the rate. I believe we did this back, it might have been 2011. We set it at $125 and inflate it going forward was the recommendation. We've calculated if it was based on the residential assessment, if it was based on the commercial assessment as options. I can state that while we've raised these formally through resolutions and while we have these conversations at the staff level involving treasurers and senior leadership at the ministries, there doesn't seem to be an appetite with the ministries and the provincial government to have the conversation or dialogue with respect to adjusting the heads and beds rate.
Talk about the candle burning at both ends. So what would prevent the municipality from passing an actual bylaw increasing the PIL by the inflationary rate and simply sending the invoices out accordingly?
So through the chair, it is a regulated legislated rate, and that would be the restriction. There wouldn't be an obligation from the agency to pay the rate, as they are obligated to pay the rate as prescribed by the province.
Interesting to have a judge look at that one for us, wouldn't it? How many municipalities charge development charges to academic institutions in Ontario? I know we had that report done for the DC committee, Mr. Chairman, but I couldn't find it. I'm sorry.
So through the chair, we did do a scan with regards to Toronto, Kingston, Waterloo, Windsor, and Ottawa, London, Niagara, and Mississauga. I can quickly go through them, or would you just like an overall?
Just the number, how many exempt DCs, or sorry, how many charge development charges?
Approximately 3.
Thank you. We wouldn't be alone if we made that change. If we actually do exempt development charges, what does it do to municipal taxes? I mean, they're building larger buildings and there's development charges that are owed on it and we exempt it. The charges doesn't go, I mean, it's actual services that have to be paid for by someone, so who's gonna pay?
So through the chair, as staff are compiling what that represents, let me just give you a sense globally where we sit today as it relates to how we budget for development charge exemptions and where the recommendations that are before committee today would place us entering into 2020. And if there were to be any amendments specific to the academic and the research exemptions, maybe Brian or Cindy can identify what that impact might amount to. So currently, as it relates to on the water wastewater budget, what we refer to as the rate budget, as well as our tax-supported levy budget combined, we fund about $15.5 million for development charge exemptions. If we were to have recommended maintaining our existing policies with where the development charges were increasing to under this bylaw, that $15.5 million would have to increase to $40 million annually. So $40 million versus 15.5, it's about $25 million, and that is both rate and levy, and I'll just remind committee that it's about $8 million levy equates to a 1% property tax increase. So again, that is if we continued the policies under the current bylaw going forward with where development charge rates are forecast to go. So again, you have some revisions to those policies. Based on those revisions, where we currently sit is about $12.7 million for discretionary exemptions and about $5 million for statutory exemptions. So that puts us at about $17.8 million, so still an increase over our 2019 budget. It would represent about a $2 million increase, and any further amendments would cause that number to go north, and then we would have to identify what the impact would be on existing ratepayers as it relates to water, wastewater, and storm amendments, and taxpayers as it relates to any of our levy-supported programs.
Ultimately, if we don't charge the DC to the developers for the actual development, then it's back onto the backs of residents, businesses paying property taxes, or ratepayers.
Through the chair, that's correct, and that's a legislative requirement.
I noticed in one of the reports that Burlington set a greenfield rate and a built boundary rate. Has anyone had a chance to look at that? Can someone explain what that means to me? Because we had talked about variable DCs, and we've had, this has been going back and forth now, I think, for the last decade anyways.
Through the chair, I can explain that one. That's actually imposed by the region. So they historically, and it goes back a number of years to when they were building the big pipes from Burlington, Oakville up to service Milton, and they were trying to come to grips with the fact that there was this, 10, 15 kilometer pipes. So they basically, to put them on equal terms, the cost of that big pipe was basically added to the normal charge. So you got a slightly higher charge if you're in Milton or Halton Hills or in North Oakville, but you've got a lower charge if you're below the Dundas Street. And that's the concept behind it. They were trying to come to grips with this very large, several $100 million of pipe just to get it up to Milton. So that's how they created that differentiation.
So it's not a perfunctory charge, it was something that was actually based on capital numbers.
Correct.
So if I can ask the indulgence, and this will be my last question, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate all your indulgence. 8.1 CG in our yellow pages that were added written submissions. And it's from a law firm, and they're questioning the DCs for Elfrida. And on page 3 of 6, it's showing that the total gross capital cost estimate out of our DC report was $343 million, and the potential DC recoverable cost was $171 million. Have anyone had a chance to actually look at these numbers and verify these numbers? Do they look familiar?
Through the chair, we've begun to go through them. We just got this letter, so we haven't gone through them line by line, but we will be reviewing the items that were identified in the letter.
Now, I know we've been talking about a pause on additional studies in Elfrida because we're looking at citywide urban boundary expansions through the comprehensive review. But this number really struck me because we've been talking about greenfield DCs, and what I'm looking at here is a significant amount of money that it looks like the ratepayers or taxpayers will be paying if this is an accurate statement. So if I could ask staff to try to crunch those numbers to verify this, because that's the type of thing that we're talking about when we're saying that greenfield development really does cost the municipal taxpayers and municipal ratepayers more than other forms of development. I know Mr. Zagaric has mentioned this a number of times, but this is a more ostensibly right-in-your-face number. So if I could just ask staff to look at that. Mr. Zagaric, do you have something to say?
Just through the chair, we can review the numbers for benefit to existing as well as if there are other revenue sources. If there were to be, I'm not suggesting there is, but if there is a grant from senior levels of government, it's all parties benefit from that as well, existing as well as developers. So we'll review the difference between the recoverable cost and the gross cost.
Thank you.
If I could, through the chair, I would note, and I haven't gone through extensively, but I do know there's a number of the works where we're putting in, say, water or sewer, and there's a small portion of the totality that's been considered part of the forecast, but not all of Elfrida. So part of what we've done is, if it $1 million water main, maybe we've just included 10% in the calculations, and the rest has been deemed post-period. So that even though it's a cash flow matter, we, subject to updating grids 2 and going through that process, if that land was in grids 2, then we would include 100% of it. So some of the deductions are post-period, and that's a cash flow matter. That's not we're not recovering it or we're paying for it through property taxes or water and sewer rates.
That's an excellent point. I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. And I also noted in the documentation that it referenced the new fire station for Upper Stony Creek, and that's irrelevant as to whether or not Elfrida happens or not, because they've already had the development happening, so the fire chief has already talked about the need for a new fire station there. Regardless of what urban boundary expansion occurs, we have challenges today, and that's in that DC calculation. So I'm aware of some of those idiosyncrasies. I appreciate the time, Mr. Chairman. Apologize for it.
Thank you very much. And I'll now ask for a motion to receive Gary's presentation, moved by Councillor Johnson, seconded by Councillor Pearson. All those in favor, carries. Gary, thanks again for your presentation and the information.
Thank you.
And we will move on to the registered delegations. And I have a small list in front of me here. And we will start with, just after Gary moves on. First on my list here are Mr. Robert Graham and David Zietsma from Redeemer University College. Good morning. The floor is yours.
Good morning. My name is Dr. Robert Graham, and I'm in my first year as a Hamilton resident and president of Redeemer University College. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Hamilton is a great place to live. Even though I'm new to the area, I've quickly come to realize the wonderful relationship between Redeemer and the city of Hamilton. I have encountered so many of Redeemer's alumni who are making a difference in and for the city. It has also been a great personally to serve the Hamilton community alongside our, for example, women's basketball team in the Hamilton Victory Gardens, and with our first-year students in the annual food drive in support of local food banks. I am so pleased to see the great relationship that we have with the community. As president, I am committed to strengthening that relationship. In short, Redeemer has a heart for the city of Hamilton, and that is how it should be. Redeemer continues to be an engaged community partner in so many ways. As a result, I'm grateful to be here today to speak to this committee. I've asked Redeemer's Vice President for External Relations and Enrollment, Dr. David Zietsma, to present a request on behalf of Redeemer about proposed changes to the development charges bylaws. Thank you.
Thank you. And on behalf of Redeemer University College, thank you to the committee for hearing this presentation this morning. Just a little bit brief background about Redeemer. So I'm sure many of you know this already, but Redeemer is a Christian undergraduate university offering Bachelor of Arts, Bachelor of Science, and Bachelor of Education degrees. We're located on 88 acres of land on Garner Road, west of Ancaster and east of the Highway 6 overpass. Redeemer is a publicly chartered university, but it is a not-for-profit university. So Redeemer is one of 23 publicly chartered universities in Ontario. 21 of those universities receive public assistance and are often referred to as publicly assisted universities. Redeemer receives no public assistance and is privately funded, and therefore sometimes gets described as a private institution, even though it is a publicly chartered Ontario university. We are also a member of Universities Canada. Redeemer currently serves approximately 700 students today. But recently, we've announced a significant tuition and fee restructuring that we believe, for our undergraduate Canadian students, that we believe will double our enrollment in the next number of years. And we anticipate by about 2024, 2025, Redeemer will be serving somewhere between 1,300 and 1,500 students. We have over 6,000 alumni, many of whom are deeply committed to seeing Hamilton thrive as a place for living. Nearly 30% of those alumni, by the way, and this is a pretty astounding statistic, nearly 30% of those alumni live in the census metropolitan area of Hamilton. So they end up locating in the city. And as President Graham has already indicated, Redeemer has been and continues to be committed to making Hamilton the best place to live. In 2013, as part of that commitment, Redeemer University College signed on to the Principles of Cooperation with the City of Hamilton, McMaster University, and Mohawk College. And in and through these principles, we sought together to work in collaboration with the post-secondary institutions in the city towards shared goals, to increasing access to education. And this includes affordability for students. So one of the number one barriers our data tells us to students accessing post-secondary education is affordability. This also means that we've agreed together to expand our impact, and that means investing in the kinds of facilities that will help generate innovative graduates who are excited to land in Hamilton and make this, and raise their families here, and as a consequence, pay taxes here. And we're interested in community building, and we're committed to that, and we want to continue to partner with the city in doing that. It's important to differentiate that Redeemer is a not-for-profit institution. We're a charitable organization. The requests we are making today are not motivated to enhance the profits of a private education enterprise, such as Columbia College, a private school, elementary, high school, which is a for-profit entity. We are a not-for-profit entity. We want to deliver post-secondary education in Hamilton that's competitively affordable and positions ourselves competitively in the higher education marketplace. We want students to come here, to stay here, and help make Hamilton a better place. Most Ontario municipalities provide a full exemption from development charges for academic spaces, and this is a really critical point, and I'll mention more about this in a minute. And development charges for Redeemer would affect significantly the level of resources we have to carry out our core mission. I think this point was sort of mentioned earlier or raised, but it is important that we also have an equitable playing field for post-secondary in Hamilton. Colleges and universities should be treated equally. Both Mohawk and Brock University's campus in Hamilton would be exempt from development charges, while Redeemer and McMaster would have to pay development charges. Most municipalities exempt both colleges and universities. Here is a list of Ontario's post-secondary academic spaces and what the development charges are. And you will note that there is only one municipality in which universities have to pay development charges. While it's true there is a 0% exemption in Ottawa and Niagara region, it is also true that by provincial charter, those universities are exempt from development charges. Redeemer does not have that exemption written into his charter, and neither does McMaster, which would make Hamilton only the second municipality to levy these charges on academic spaces for universities. And you can find this chart in Appendix B of, I think it's the yellow document you have, 8.1A. Redeemer does have an impact, we believe, a positive economic impact on the city, with nearly, with over $6 million in expenditures by our local students, nearly 500 jobs directly related, and nearly 50,000 annual visitors coming to campus. And this is a very significant contribution to the local economy. And this schedule of economic impact can be found in Appendix D of your packet. We believe Redeemer has a positive impact on the city, and we want to grow that impact. and development charges may inhibit our ability to invest to the extent which we wish in doing this. But examples of some of the partnerships that Redeemer is currently engaged in, of course, is City Lab, Sustainable Hamilton Burlington, the Shadok Watershed Monitoring Project that our students have been very active in for a number of years now, Our Future Hamilton, the Ancaster Soccer Club, and so on and so forth. And our alumni have stayed in the city, and they've done some pretty innovative and neat things to make Redeemer a better place. If we think of organizations like Indwell, Affordable Housing, Barefoot Babies, Relay Coffee, New Hope Community Bikes, and many other organizations which have been significantly impacted or led by Redeemer alumni who have a heart for this city and this community. With the significant tuition and fee restructuring that's taken place at the university in the past few months, we have anticipated significant growth, as I mentioned earlier, and that growth has building and structural infrastructure consequences and impacts for us. And so we are on the very early part of a phase of significant campus development, which includes new facilities, student residence, which will need to be up and running within about 2 years if possible, new academic teaching and learning spaces, and other facilities that will serve students at Redeemer. The total charges, this can be found in Appendix C of the packet, the schedule of additional development charges that Redeemer would face if this proposal goes forward would be over $8 million over the next 5 years in additional development charges. And that is a significant impact for a not-for-profit charitable organization like Redeemer, and that impact would doubtless be passed on to students that want to come and study at Redeemer and then fall in love with the city of Hamilton and consequently stay here. So we want to keep Redeemer as affordable as possible so that students come to this city and fall in love with the city and desire to have an impact on the city and raise their families and pay taxes in the city. To summarize, our request is this, that not-for-profit post-secondary institutions continue to be fully exempt from development charges for academic spaces, those spaces that are dedicated to the teaching, learning, and research that takes place at the university level. And this is different than a grant program because it would give us stability and long-term certainty around what we would face when we're making investments in students and in campus development. Second request, and so we're differentiating here between academic learning spaces and student residences. And so I want that to be clear. That's why we have them broken down into two parts here, is that the exemption for development charges on student residences be grandfathered in for Redeemer on any projects started on or before January 1, 2021. So we understand the need for the city to wrestle with how to raise the revenues required to serve its residents. We understand the need to remove the extra or the 50% exemption for student residences, and we're asking that that be grandfathered to us on any new residences we build, considering that part of our planning and restructuring our tuition and fee structure was knowing that we would have to build a residence, and that was part of our work on taking that action so that we be grandfathered on that change. Thank you very much for this time.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, and I have Councillor Ferguson first on the list.
Thank you and welcome, gentlemen. Let me start by saying how privileged I feel to be able to represent you as your councillor. I consider Redeemer a real jewel in my community, and you do great work in our community. I see Redeemer students regularly at the food drive, for example, and out helping the community regularly. I know a lot of my colleagues get complaints about students around other educational institutions that they're out rebel-rousing, and I never get that. Other than on snowstorms, apparently your students are out helping pushing cars out of driveways and assisting that way. So you're a credible jewel, and I'll do whatever I can to support you. And Dr. it's nice to meet you. I've heard a lot about you, but I never had the opportunity to see what you really look like. And so it's a privilege. I see David all the time. He's around regularly talking about your issues. My first question to you, I learned this through expression this morning called a crown agency. Never heard about that before. You're always learning in this job. Is that, that seems to be the magic bullet, if you will, to avoid DCs if you look at Redeemer and Mohawk. Have you ever considered becoming a crown agency, or because you're a private university, you're not eligible to get it.
The Crown agencies, in terms of the colleges are essentially owned by the province. So the universities exist by charter, so a legislative act that constitutes their ability to deliver degree programming. So Redeemer's charter is a public charter. It's an act of provincial parliament that allows us to deliver the degrees we do and to operate as a university in Ontario. No, we have not considered becoming a Crown corporation because that would change significantly the kind of institution we are, and universities in Ontario are not typically Crown corporations.
So Brock University then is owned by the province, but McMaster is not. Just to educate me on this. I'm sure Mac will do that in a few minutes also.
So the inequity here comes from Brock having a provincial charter that exempts it from development charges. So any campus development they do in Hamilton would continue to be exempt, while McMaster and Redeemer, where they're two universities that are actually anchored in Hamilton, would now be paying development charges. So should Brock desire to do so, and I haven't reviewed their strategic plan recently, but should Brock desire to build significant campus in Hamilton, they would not be paying development charges, whereas if McMaster and Redeemer want to invest in their home city, they would be, and that's a question of equity.
And I see the list of projects that you're anticipating in the foreseeable future. I know it all depends on enrollment. But I see it. Have you done the arithmetic, what that impact will be to you financially, based on the list that you've got in front of us today?
So that is the schedule of development charges we would have to pay.
It's $8 million impact to you.
And that would be borne significantly by students and private donors. So about 75% of our funding comes through student tuition dollars, and around 25% through donors or ancillary services.
Of course, the purpose of development charges is that you, first of all, bring water into the facility and do whatever you do with it and send it back out, most of it. And I would suspect the residents would consume more water than the academic sites. I know your athletic center, I believe, is outsized now. It doesn't meet current regulations.
Yes, correct. So
it seems to make sense on the resident side because you do demand that we have a sewage treatment plant and send your product there, and whatever you do with the water when you send it out. How do you feel about that?
We understand the cities and are empathetic to the city's need. I'm a resident of Hamilton. I pay property taxes. We understand the city's need to find the revenues needed to serve the city. We understand and are sympathetic to the need to put a full development charge on residences. The students are there, they're showering, they're there 24/7 for the most part during 8 months of the year. And so we're sympathetic to that, and therefore our request is that the student residents that we need fairly urgently, given the increase in applications that we're seeing, we're asking that to be grandfathered, understanding that thereafter there would be 100% development charges on student residences. And our main concern is that the exemption for academic spaces, the places where the students are coming in to learn, to innovate, to engage with faculty, to engage with the city, and understand and learn more about what it means to live here and make a difference here, that those spaces continue to be exempt. That is our first and foremost request, the second being that we grandfather the residents we are intending to build by 2021.
Okay, that's all my questions for now, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor, and I believe it's Councillor Danko who's next on my list.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just help me understand the differences between a publicly chartered university and a private college, such as Columbia College, because when I look at the numbers for Columbia College, they have 1,800 students, about 2.5 times the amount of Redeemer. They have 6 residences, and they pay DCs and full municipal property taxes. So just a little bit about the difference between the two.
So Columbia College is a for-profit business. So they've decided that the best business to make a profit for their owners or shareholders or whatever the case is to run an education facility. They are not a university or college, so that's another significant difference. Not-for-profit education institutions are chartered through the province, unless they are Crown-owned, which is true for the colleges, to serve the public good. They are not for profit. They are owned by no one. They are governed by a board. They are charitable organizations that people can donate to, both McMaster and Redeemer. And so the job of, as we understand it, is to help serve Ontarians who are seeking a certain kind of university education as to serve the public good. And Redeemer has a specific charter to do that in a certain way. McMaster has a specific charter to do that in a certain way. Brock has a specific charter to do that in a certain way. Brock has the good fortune to be exempt from development charges in their charter. McMaster and Redeemer do not. There are other examples, I believe, in the city of for-profit post-secondary institutions. I believe for a while is at Everest College on Upper James. It closed recently, but that would have been owners who said, how can we make profit? How can we make money on offering some kind of education? That is not what Redeemer is. Is that?
Yes, and I'm glad you mentioned the public good in there. I'm going to circle back to that in a moment. Help me to understand how your tuition fees are set in the context that if we were to increase the development charges as is proposed, is it possible for you to, as a business would, pass that on, increase your tuition fees and just pass that on to the students? Is there any legislation that restricts you from doing that?
No.
So when I look at the estimated costs and projections that you presented, I think the number is $8.295 million in development fees that Redeemer would otherwise be responsible for, which, as we just established, would be passed on to students and your donors, 25%. If we don't increase the development fees, those $8.295 million is subsidized by taxpayers. So coming back to the public good, that's the test where I'm going to base this decision on, is what is the public interest in taxpayers subsidizing Redeemer to the tune of $8.295 million? Help me with that.
So again, I would make the case that with over 6,000 alumni, we have 30%, nearly 30% of those that we can identify as living in the census metropolitan area of Hamilton and making a contribution in this area. Close to 20%, or 1 in 5, are choosing actually to live in Hamilton itself, the rest in the Burlington, Stony, Grimsby, the CMA. So those individuals are paying taxes. They're creating new sorts of organizations and businesses. They're working in businesses and helping businesses to flourish. And from our perspective, you are recovering those taxes and dollars by attracting more students to Hamilton rather than an increased tuition, which will dampen the amount of students we can attract to Hamilton to come and live here. Ultimately, this is about affordability for Hamilton. And at the front end, yes, the levy or the taxes are not there when the student, for the 4 years the student is on our campus, but they're going to be there shortly after when the student is living, working, and loving this community.
Thank you. And like I said, that part of the argument is the most important part for me anyway, is the public interest, because every business, every developer has the same affordability arguments, but I think there is a difference between the measurement of the public good. Last question is, in your presentation, you're specifically asking for exemption for nonprofit post-secondary institutions. Is there, besides the fact that you're a post-secondary institution, is there any particular reason why you focused in on post-secondary?
Primarily because we're a post-secondary institution, and in the context of the post-secondary marketplace, if you will, in Ontario, this would make us less competitive in that framework. However, we're also differentiating between private for-profit education, which are businesses, versus those chartered to serve the public interest. Obviously, we have equal concern about education institutions across the board that are not-for-profit charitable organizations. Many students that flow through non-public or non-separate schools, so independent schools or not-for-profit Christian schools in the greater Hamilton area actually do, Redeemer is a live and real choice for them. And so we have concern about academic and learning space overall, because Those are the spaces that help people get connected to what's meaningful in our community. Those are the spaces where students can engage with what are the challenges before us? How do we make life more sustainable? How do we make the environment more sustainable? How do we build better communities and neighborhoods? It's in those academic spaces where creativity and innovation and learning and engagement takes place. And we're going to say at the front end, we're going to increase the cost to invest in those spaces. And I think, and our proposal is based on the idea that let's make those spaces affordable as possible in the city. And when those students choose to live here and invest here at the end of their educational journey, that's recoverable through them living in the city, working in the city, building homes in the city.
Thank you for that, and I appreciate the delegation and the honest answers. It's been very helpful for me. So that's all my questions, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Councillor Clark, you're next.
Give a quick preamble, which is not usual for me, but I can recall Redeemer. I'm not taking a shot at anyone, I'm just saying. I can recall Redeemer College, and in 1999, it was member Skarika and I that went to Ministers Janet Ecker lobbying for you to receive a university designation. And it was a challenge because we were in essence creating a faith-based university, which the ministry staff were dead set against. But at the end of the day, reasonable minds came through and the charter was granted, and you've been accredited now. You also have students leaving as teachers now also, so you've received accreditation on a number of cases. So congratulations across the board in terms of what the quality of the students are that is coming out of Redeemer. All of that makes it difficult for me to be asking these questions because I truly like Redeemer and I support Redeemer, but I have a job as a counselor to balance all ends, and this is one of the challenges that I have, so get ready. So you don't pay any property taxes and you don't pay any payments in lieu. You're totally exempt from that, and yet you're a university. And you're asking to be treated the same as other universities who pay payment in lieu fees. They pay heads and beds, but you don't. There seems to be a cognitive dissonance there. On one side, you're asking to be treated fairly and equally, but on the other side, you have a tremendous advantage over other universities.
When you mentioned heads and beds tax, we had a brief discussion with our group. We were not aware of the heads and beds tax that would apply there, and we're willing to engage in a conversation with city staff about that. We are a not-for-profit charity, and therefore, if my understanding is correct, property taxes are not levied on not-for-profit charities.
You're a university, though. I mean, there's no doubt about that. You're a university, and you're asking me to be treated the same as other universities, but in reality, you're not paying any property taxes, including the payments in lieu. So we need to be clear about that. And that's not a municipal decision. That's a provincial decision. So this municipality can't tomorrow say, okay, we're going to charge you payments in lieu, just like we can't increase them. So you need to understand that that's the case there.
Correct, and yep.
So help me understand something else. In Hamilton, our taxes have historically been high. At one point, we were 11% over provincial averages, and I'm watching staff to shake yes or no in case I'm off on the numbers, and we're down to 6% over the provincial average, which still means that our property taxes are higher than other municipalities in our cohort and in our community. The one challenge that we have that is immensely different than other municipalities is the ability to pay. And in our community, you have a good quarter of the community, 25% of the people who really struggle paying any increase in property taxes. And so that's why we fight tooth and nail to find ways to ensure that the property taxes do not go up so that those who have that inability to pay are not unfairly burdened. When we continue to exempt development charges across this community, we are putting that burden on those very same people who have an inability to pay. So I'm trying to balance that against a not-for-profit university that charges full tuition to their students, that is doing incredibly well, And you even grant some scholarships to students who can't afford your tuition, which I give you full credit for. But at the end of the day, if we can't put the charges onto the taxpayers without impacting those who cannot pay, we have to make sure that we're paying for these fees somewhere. We don't have the reserves to cover us off forever, so naturally there's been an incremental over time increase in development charges. And that's what I'm struggling so hard. I see the numbers, but I also understand that if you don't pay that $8 million, that goes on the taxpayers or the ratepayers in our community, people who cannot afford to pay. And I'm not sure that when I look at the total number of the students in your Redeemer University, if they're facing those same challenges that those people, 25% of our residents are facing. They're not in the same box. You give scholarships to those who are, the rest are paying full tuition.
So
help me balance this.
actually, about 90% of our students have to have financial assistance through OSAP. And again, as a university, our students qualify for OSAP, and therefore, our students do need assistance. Our third-party...
Sorry, help me, Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry to cut him off, but 90% is assistance, OSAP is a loan.
They're going into debt, yes.
Yes, yes.
So they're going to debt.
Those are the rest of the people at McMaster and Brock and all across the province, just to be clear. You're not alone on that.
Right, but almost all of those other universities are exempt from development charges, either by charter or by municipal exemption.
We're talking about fixing that for everybody.
So, I would suggest that our students are not in a great position to bear added costs, and it's one of the reasons why we've undertaken a significant tuition restructuring initiative. I would also suggest that the hope would be that we reduce the 25% of the population that has difficulty paying the property tax by educating more of the population through affordable post-secondary education that can help them land the kinds of jobs and the kinds of opportunities in the community that can not only create organizations that create better neighborhoods, but that raise the bar for everyone. And education is critical in creating a community that has a strong business base, but also, I believe, a community that cares about its neighbors and wants to raise the bar for everybody. And it's an investment in creating a stronger tax base down the road by educating students. And, you know, our students have a demonstrated legacy of impacting the city positively in many different ways to make it a more livable space and a more a space where neighbors are cared for and communities are stronger because of our alumni.
My last question, just for clarity. I think I heard earlier that you said 30% of the residents, or 30% of the students have residency in Hamilton?
30% of our graduates.
30% of the graduates
Yep.
have residence in Hamilton.
Yep.
So 70% leave the city.
In the CMA, yes, but that would be, we're attracting them from everywhere. We're not taking them from Hamilton and sending 70% out. We're taking them from all over the country and bringing them here, and nearly 30% are choosing to stay.
I admire the work that you do. I respect you fighting tooth and nail to find savings for university. I'm struggling here deeply trying to find the balance between who pays. Residents who can't afford the property taxes, or the universities and developers who are doing the development. And that's just the struggle that I have, and I have to come to a decision on it. But I do appreciate all of your input.
Again, we're asking for academic, research, and learning spaces to continue to be exempt.
I understand.
Not every single aspect of what we develop.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Councillor Wilson, questions for the presenters?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for taking the time and being here today and advocating on behalf of your institution. I fully respect that. For many, many years now, similar to Councillor Clark's comments, we have known that those with the very least in this city are paying the most in property taxes. And that is what I am very mindful of. That is the public good, I think, and our fiduciary moral responsibility to be mindful of and care for in our city building efforts, along with our requirements to be environmental stewards. So this is obviously a very difficult calculation we have to make. I did have one question on a remark that you made, and I just want to clarify it because we've had a lot of discussion here about a level playing field and what is not a Crown agency. And you said, in fact, you didn't wish to become a Crown agency. This is your word. That would change the kind of university we are. What does that mean? May I ask through you, Mr. Chairman?
Well, my understanding would be that we would cease to be an independent university like all the other universities, and the government would decide how the school would be run, or have a significant say in what kind of organization we would be, rather than us operating according to the legislative act which constitutes us now. We would cease to operate by the legislative act, and we would become an organ of the provincial government. That would be a significant difference. And I'm not sure the provincial government has any desire to turn us into a Crown agency. I think they may be going, that might not be what they desire to do.
No doubt, no doubt. So how does that desire not to fall under the rules and the directives of government affect something like you talked about your students and where they come from, your admissions? Through you, Mr. Chairman.
Sorry, I misunderstood.
The students who are going to your university, does that impact how or who or they go to your university?
Whether or not we're a Crown Corp, we are subject to all the acts around post-secondary education and quality assurance, including the PESI Act from 2000, and we operate within those acts that bound all publicly chartered universities.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, gentlemen. I have no further speakers at this point in time. Appreciate the delegation
Very
still
much.
this morning. And I'll now move on to our second presenter, Jesse Newton from Oak Hill Academy. Is Jesse here? Morning, Jesse.
Morning, Chair, Councillor Collins. Thank you for
Floor's yours.
Thank you for having me today. I don't have a presentation, but I did submit a letter and a brochure, just so you can see a little bit about us there, and basically what I want to speak about to you today. My name is Jesse Newton. I'm the principal at Oak Hill Academy, a brand new nonprofit elementary school functioning in Ferguson's ward. Right now we're renting a facility up in Ancaster out of a church. This is our first year. I think we're on day 140 school days, and we're excited. My request to you today is simple: is to continue the development charge exemption for nonprofit elementary and secondary schools. I believe in the minutes that I read, and my understanding is that they have their own exemption line, so that's my request, to continue the exemption for nonprofit elementary, secondary schools. I'd like to begin by acknowledging first that the city desires to move toward a full cost recovery model in their expenses, on the levies and the ratepayers. I understand that. And as a municipal taxpayer, I think it's a responsible move, and I'm on board with that in general. My previous career, I was working in engineering consulting, particularly in the municipal sector, water, wastewater, so I'm generally in favor of make the user pay, and I think it's a responsible policy. However, there are several aspects to this particular exemption and to the realities of nonprofit schools that require, I think, reconsideration, and that I would argue would be in favor of maintaining the current exemption. The first thing to note is that publicly funded schools will remain exempt from development charges. So whether it's one of the public board or the separate board or the French boards, Any development that they have will remain, and I believe that's, again, a legislated exemption. So it's almost as if our families who pay high tuition rates, there's the cost of education, who are also taxpayers in the city of Hamilton, will continue to pay for both the public schools or separate boards that they're not attending. In addition, this cost would fall upon them or on donors. So that's the first thing to note there. The second would be is that independent nonprofit schools in Ontario perform a public function, but at private expense. And largely this expense is paid for through our tuition rates, through families who are also taxpayers, and also through the generosity of donors who just see the value and vision of providing educational choice for families and children. And as I mentioned, that these families continue to live in Hamilton and pay their municipal taxes. The third piece there is that independent schools save taxpayers money on the whole. Speaking provincial tax dollars here, but the 2013 Auditor General's report for Ontario noted and estimated that private schools in effect save taxpayers about $1 billion annually, or enable the Education Ministry to allocate this money to other education priorities. So that's $1 billion annually that independent elementary and secondary K-12 schools save the public purse, the provincial purse. And I think that's also a noteworthy thing. We don't have any access to public funding, $0 operating, $0 capital, again, 100% through tuition and generous donations. The next piece of reality is that there's a bit of a myth sometimes out there that the people attending independent schools are wealthy or upper middle class or upper class and can afford it. But the reality is, at least in our school and in the schools that I'm familiar with, my school specifically, our school, all of our families are middle class, hardworking families. They're making big sacrifices to send their child to our school and to other schools as well. And that includes our staff, our faculty, who take risks and cuts to come and buy into the vision and invest in the future of our children. The fifth piece would be low-income families. We have a heart, and I think nonprofit schools in general have a heart for making their schools accessible to any family, regardless of their ability to pay. So we're currently developing our bursary system, which includes funds and the process by which we would administer bursaries. And so we want to make our school accessible and affordable to families who want an Oak Hill education and desire it, regardless of their ability to afford it. The sixth piece would be that nonprofit schools, elementary and secondary schools in Hamilton, I don't believe are a significant source of DC revenue for the city of Hamilton. Right now we're renting. We would like to be in a facility that would house us, whether that's again another rental down the road, or whether that's developing, or whether that's purchasing an already developed building. We don't know right now, but we do know that we are growing and we need space. And we would not be an ongoing annual cash flow, and I don't think the nonprofit elementary, secondary schools are a significant source of revenue. It would add about, my understanding is that it's about $190 per square foot to develop an elementary, secondary school. So we want to be an integrated K-12 school. Our class size cap is about 16 students. That's about 224 or 44 students. So that's at about 10% that the current non-industrial institutional rate of $20.54 per square foot. That would add about $600,000 to any development funds that we would need to. And that would come directly, it would not come from tuition, so that would all be separately fundraised. And all of our fundraising dollars, again, go to make tuition in general affordable for our families, or they go into our bursary fund. So every dollar we spend on development charges or anything of that nature reduces the ability of families who desire our school for their family. I think the last piece here is a bit of a personal piece. I I love the city of Hamilton. I'm born and bred here, born in McMaster, Stratton Avenue, lived up on West Mountain for a little bit, grew up on the East Mountain. I spent a number of years in different neighborhoods, Hess Street and Concession Street, McMaster University for 8 years, undergrad and graduate degree there. Dr. Brian Bates there, he was a former chair of the civil engineering department there. He took all of our senior engineering students out on about 10 trips around to see the jewels of Hamilton. So, you know, the history of the Lister block and different areas of like this. And he imparted and gave words and color to the love that I have for the city. And now we're raising our own family over in the Riverdale neighborhood. And I want to impart the same love for place to our students too, not just doesn't come through textbooks, and that's why we, our families, put some skin in the game to nurture children, Hamilton's children. That's all I have to say, and I appreciate you guys serving your city. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jesse. And I do have a speaker in Councillor Clark. Councillor Clark, questions for Mr. Newton?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And just one, a number of us around the table actually are intrigued by the chairman's suggestion of creating a grant program for the academic organizations who are building new facilities. They can come to the city and file for a grant. We've provided some significant grants to McMaster University over the past few years, so it's not unheard of. What would you say to that type of program if we create the DC program, maybe a little bit, make it including more equitable and equal across the entire jurisdiction, but also have an opportunity for institutions like yours to come to us and say, here's what we're planning to build, here's the business case, here's how much money we'd like to ask of you. That type of program would enable us to be really treating everyone equal across the board.
Thank you. Good question. I have a couple of reactions to that. First, I guess having like a bursary fund where there's a separate application, I guess it's still in terms of making our school affordable to families and higher need families. It's still a risk factor, right? So to us, it's like, you know, the bursaries are never guaranteed, something we still have to account for. So that's one piece. The second piece is I think maintaining that, like, you know, publicly funded elementary and secondary schools never, well, at present they're legislatively exempt, and our families, like, my family personally, we still pay our taxes go to fund the schools that our children do not benefit from. All of our families, we have 12 families right now, 16 projected for next year and growing. They all pay taxes that support the elementary and secondary schools that they do not access. And now this would be an additional levy because, again, all of our families support, their taxes, again, support the development charge exemption and carry the cost of that exemption for publicly funded schools. And so to me, it seems like a matter of that is the equity or the fair playing field there. Like, we're a registered charity. I don't know if the difference is nonprofit versus a profit school. I think it does make a difference, but I feel like that's just, you know, even in the revenue, the CRA in deciding like what counts as a charitable organization, charitable acts, and education is one of those that are just generally noted to be performing a public benefit. So again, I go back to my first points. Publicly funded schools remain exempt, and that's where I think the piece lands for me.
What's the tuition for your students annually?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Good question. So there's a few pieces. So our family maximum rate, I'll contextualize it first. So I just did a calculation about it's operating costs for publicly funded schools per student, not including capital, is about $12,000. These are based on 2017, 2018 numbers you can find on the Ministry of Education's website. Divide their non-capital operating budget by the number of students in the school. So $12,000 per student. We have a $14,000 family rate maximum, so regardless of how many children you have. If you have one child that's full-time in grade 1, 5 days a week, it's $10,000 for that child. And if you have our kindergarten program is 3 days a week. It's $6,000 for families that have one child in kindergarten, but $14,000 is our family rate maximum. So if you have 3 children, 5 children, that's the maximum. So.
Okay. And you do understand that the public school system is not regulated by the municipality. It's the provincial regulation in terms of what they pay in terms of heads and beds versus DCs, et cetera. We don't make that decision.
I understand, and I wish that exemption would apply to any academic space, elementary, secondary, that is listed, which we are, with the Ministry of Education, that has the right to operate as a private school. I don't know if that's the piece there that we get legislatively exempt through the provincial. That's also a lot of work, but.
Okay. I thank you for coming today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor. Thanks, Jesse, again for your presentation today. And no other speakers at this point in time, so we'll move on to the next delegation. Next, I have Dan Postma from Calvin Christian School. Dan here. Morning, Dan.
Good morning, Chair. Good morning, councillors. Thank you for having me. I'm here to speak on behalf of Calvin Christian School. I'm a parent there of 2 kids, a third one eventually coming into the school system. I'm a member of the board of directors, and I am here with a very simple request. It's much in line with what Jesse was arguing. We request that the City of Hamilton continue its exemptions for elementary, not-for-profit schools to grow their teaching and learning spaces. Obviously, we are an elementary school. We have no residential component, and so our stormwater, wastewater requirements are much less dense than a university that has residences. We are seeking to continue to have equitable exemption for our teaching and learning space. I will take about 4 minutes and then some questions if I can beg your indulgence. Calvin Christian School has been in existence for over 65 years. We serve over 500 students every year. We are waitlisting dozens of families right now, which is a great problem to have. It's also a problem. I will get to our growth plans shortly. We, as Calvin Christian School, and Councillor Danko, I appreciate you bringing up the public good argument. I'm going to speak to that very briefly. Calvin performs the same public good function as all of our elementary, public, and Catholic school board peers. We perform the same educatory function pursuant to the same Ministry of Education Act for the purposes of education and raising up our next generation. We perform that same act, but notably we do it without any public funding, zero capital, zero operating. I'm going to scroll down so I can see all my notes. Based on 500 students, I also want to speak about our replacement cost. If Calvin Christian School, which, by the way, if you've driven past it, it's on West 5th, at the corner of West 5th and Mohawk, green facade at the front, school playground. If Calvin ceased to exist tomorrow, our 500 students would need to be housed and educated by the public or Catholic school boards. Based on the current Ontario rate of $12,300 per pupil funding, that means that Calvin Christian School saves the public purse, this municipality, $6.1 million every year, just by existing. And I've heard some conversation about the least able to pay municipal property taxes being asked to be dinged for this new exemption, if we were to be awarded our continued exemption. I would also, on the other hand, remind that we continue to save the City of Hamilton millions of dollars that our parents, including myself, pay for the privilege of an education that starts from a religious perspective of the parents. It's a parent-run school. We always say we are a parent-run, staff-directed. I'm on the board. We are a school that dares to ask what the purpose of education is, and not just academically, not just financially, economically, the kind of career you move on to, but religiously, philosophically. What is the meaning of education? What kind of person contributes civically and socially? I'll get to that in just a minute. 86% of our 265, my slide showing, great, families live in the amalgamated city of Hamilton. You can see this would not be the typical map for a bounded public or Catholic school. Our families come from a long way away. Still, 86% of them are in the city of Hamilton. Many community groups use our space. So this is talking more about public function as well. At least 8 adult or children's sports rec leagues play in our school. Fundraising dinners are hosted by various charities. 3 different community churches worship on our site. We host community food truck days, bazaars, fundraisers, Jump Rope for Heart, Terry Fox, Hope for Haiti, Mission Services, Neighbor to Neighbor, City Kids. CCS hosts co-op students from both private and public high schools. Our award-winning choir sings at Juravinsky regularly, at various malls, and they make the rounds of all the nursing homes. Our grade 6 class was recently recognized by the Hamilton Conservation Authority for their invasive species study. Each class participates in a community service project. And I just saw the blueprints for this yesterday. We plan to construct an inclusive playground that will be recognized as a demonstration site for inclusivity, available during public events and for rentals. That is on our property at West 5th and Mohawk. This exemption removal, if Calvin ends up being grouped into this removal of exemptions from development charges, it will set our school apart from our peer elementary and Catholic schools across the city. It will single us out to pay for the purposes of pay for what we're trying to get at with DCs, which we support if funded fairly. Targeting one of your elementary partners, I would argue, is a discriminatory act, and not the others. It's a discriminatory act. It discourages fostering the kind of education and innovation that is core to the City of Hamilton's future success. Revenue realized by the city, if these DCs are levied against independent, not-for-profit elementary teaching and learning spaces, will be marginal. But I would characterize it as a drop in the bucket for this body to consider. But for us, the impact on our capital growth campaign, recall that we get no public funding for capital or operating, but we do serve public function. For us, the campaign would be massive. The implication would be massive. Calvin has a strategic growth committee working right now studying our options because we are waitlisting dozens of families. We are including financial feasibility and fundraising feasibility. We believe we will need additional space by 2019 or 2020 of up to 100 students, and that's to start. It is distinctly possible that these development charges will keep us from growing within the city of Hamilton. It will keep us from the tipping point. At a count of 100 students, if this new development charges force us not to proceed with our growth campaign, those kids who are waitlisted with us right now will still need to be educated. It's easy for them to get lost in the mix, but the public and Catholic school boards will have to pick up the slack. This means an additional funding to house new space for them, an additional funding required of over $1.2 million per year. And that's before considering the $2.8 million it would cost for construction of adequate new space. If we don't build that new space, it will be up to the public and Catholic school boards to house them. I wanted to bust a couple of myths, and I've heard one about the economic one in particular. But first I'm going to start with a myth that is commonly told about especially Christian schools, private, not-for-profit schools, parent-run, tuition paid. I'm quoting here. In Ontario, private schools number over 500 different school units and have a total enrollment of approximately 80,000 students. They would appear to be increasing in size and number. They exist by virtue of the interest and sacrifice of a significant number of concerned and dedicated people who support these schools in addition to paying their school taxes. These schools and their supporters cannot be dismissed with a respectful wave of the hand. These parents are not a lunatic fringe living on the periphery of society, and these schools cannot be accurately and fairly considered as divisive, second-class, elitist, or snobbish, as the label private might denote. That quote is from a 1984 Ontario Government Commission, and it's from Dalton McGuinty Sr., father of the recent Ontario Premier. The numbers since 1984 have more than doubled. From 2005 to 2015, public school enrollments across the province dropped 5.9%. Independent school enrollments rose 12%. I also work for a Hamilton employer called Cardis, and we have been studying public and private education for over a decade. In our 2018 education bulletin, based on primary research conducted by the University of Notre Dame, we found that graduates of independent schools in Ontario, like Calvin, are 3 to 9% more likely to demonstrate trust in strangers, co-workers, people in their religious congregations, and all their neighbors, compared to public school graduates. We also found independent graduates to have more openness to and involvement in civic life. Religious school graduates, stronger in social ties, twice as likely to confide in close friends, and are more likely to have friends at work compared to public school graduates. In total, graduates of schools like Calvin have a diverse array of social ties. We are not cloistered. We are not in a bunker. We are here for the good of the city. Second myth, many people believe that parents choose non-government schools because of that those parents must have higher socioeconomic class than parents choosing government schools. The data does not support this. A report in 2007 found that parents among private schools, choosing religiously defined private schools report notably lower income than those parents choosing academically defined private schools. A more recent 2017 study comparing family income of students in Alberta found that if you remove the elite top 15% that are the super elite schools, think Upper Canada College, if you remove them from the equation, average after-tax income for families of independent schools is 1.8% lower than average after-tax income for parents in public schools. It is not that we are richer, we're making bigger sacrifices. This is why the new development charges are discriminatory. Independent schools are partners in education, just like public and Catholic board, but we are being unfairly and narrowly targeted. We support the purpose of the development charges. We support their goals of developing Hamilton's downtown and incentivizing industrial and office sectors, but we cannot support them if they are unfairly funded, and if they are in an unjust or discriminatory manner. We request that the City of Hamilton continue its equitable exemption for nonprofit elementary teaching and learning spaces. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. And I do have one councillor with questions. Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to be sure, when you use the term government school, you mean public schools, right?
Yes, publicly funded schools.
Publicly funded
of Catholic and non-Catholic varieties.
And your students your families choose to enroll in your your school, right?
Yes, yep. It's entirely opt-in.
It's opt-in. Thank you.
Okay. Dan, that's all the questions we have this morning. We appreciate your presentation and the information you provided. We'll move on to our next delegation. Next on my list, I have Mr. Sergio Meng from Urban Solutions. Morning, Serge.
Chairman, members of committee, staff, thank you for your time this morning. I will be brief. I just have a couple of comments with respect to more so policy issues, not so much what you are requesting, meaning of change monetary. Before I do that, I just want to thank a few people. Lindsay Gills for always answering and following up and giving us information when we ask. Thank you so much. And of course, Brian, Jason, and Mike for this. This is a heavy process. I know it well, and I know it's not an easy one for everyone. There's a few points, actually 4 or 5, that I want to discuss. Tiering in the system, infills, phasing periods, rental housing, and Section 37. So I'll take about 5 minutes to go through this. And if there's any questions, I'd be more than happy to address them. As mentioned, I'm Sergio Manchia from Urban Solutions. We are always involved in these development charges as we do projects. And I also do some projects on my own, and they have some effect on how we bring matters to market. I'd like to start off with the tiering component. And what I mean by this is that I think there should be some consideration, similar to Burlington, where they tier either residential or non-residential. And then within the non-residential, going one step further. And where I'm going with this is it's about industrial and office space in particular with regards to commercial. And for example, all our industrial parks are doing quite well. There's new ones coming along. But what happens, and I've had this discussion with staff, and I'm not implying that they agreed or disagreed, but they basically answered, it's basically the policy at hand. So I think we're all in agreement that we want our industrial parks to prosper, but also have the ability to not just be warehousing, but bring individuals to work. In other words, bring new office space within these industrial parks. Having said that, if you have an industrial park and you want to introduce an office, it will be deemed as commercial. And then we're dealing with almost double the cost associated with the DCs. And that's a heavy hit because we're not selling widgets when we're building office space. We're employing people. And for example, I'm going to use existing and not the new rates because there's not much difference. So once again, I'm not here to debate the dollars. The commercial rate is $20.54. The industrial is $12.53. That's a big jump. And that jump in itself could really hinder, and it actually does hinder, new office buildings that could be created within industrial parks. And I think that's important because our industrial parks are either kind of old or kind of new. And the older ones are going to regenerate new types of stock. And the newer ones, for example, Hamilton Central Park, Central Business Park, where I'm involved in, we want to bring office space. And they create very important jobs. The office space of once upon a time ago wasn't, it was rather 120 square feet per person on average. Now it's a lot less, almost half that. That's because we don't have as much paper. We basically use bigger screens. There's open areas, less walls, etc. So we're into what we call flex spaces. And those are 1 to 2 stories, maybe 3, but they're growing. You'll see them on the QE in Oakville, a lot in the Vaughan area. Burlington is starting on that. And these are great pockets for employment, to bring people to make money. So I really would appreciate if there's consideration by this committee and council, and of course with the hopes that staff's input on this, that we could have that tiering system where you have an opportunity for office employment uses in industrial, deemed as industrial, so they're charged industrial rates. I think there's a net benefit. Again, I don't think that anyone is adverse to office space in these employment areas, but it does get expensive. My next point is just the infills themselves in the smaller parts of the older parts of the city, meaning Ancaster, Binbrook, Stony Creek, etc., Dundas. These have pockets in areas where we're seeing a combination of lots being put together, new developments coming across, including infill, residential and commercial. And we are still subject to, if it's not a brownfield, it's still subject to the regular development charges. And we feel that since the services are there, and I appreciate development charges not simply is for new infrastructure or new needs, but maintaining the services, I believe that those particular developments have already paid their fair share of that infrastructure, and we should continue to charge them, and more importantly, generate taxes as we develop these infills for higher and best use. With regards to brownfields on infills, I think there should be consideration for brownfields. I know that we have the ERASE program, but the ERASE program is not going to continue forever. We do know that. It's been an amazing tool. I can't tell you how many projects I've been involved with that have basically enhanced areas that we never thought could. Not simply just for development, but for the betterment of the community from an environmental end. And that eventually will deplete, or similar to the downtown improvement plans, that will deplete. So please have some consideration that brownfield areas, or areas that will need some consideration to clean up, should be not exempt, but once again reviewed under these policies. With regards to longer phasing periods, I want to stress that the industry from the residential, just across construction, is changing. You'll hear from some other members within the industry that will say, there are people not closing deals. And that's unheard of. And I've been through 3 recessions, and 1990s was a bad one. And I'm implying that we're into a recession, but I'm worried that 10% of the deals that are out there are not closing, which means they're walking away from deposits. And those deposits are heavy to come by for first-time home buyers or any person in general. $30,000, $40,000, $50,000. They're just walking away. And why is that happening? It's costs. So it's not just Hamilton, it's across Ontario. And we've discussed this amongst us all many, many times about affordability and how do we get there. I know what you have to do, and I know it has to be done. But I honestly feel that if we bring it in as a transition, it might help the scenario at hand. The economics of today is different than the economics of 5 years ago. And I'm confident that it will rebound, and I'm confident you'll collect all this, but if you can have some consideration with respect to how we bring it in. July 6th is not far off, and there's going to be a mad rush, and I'm sure staff's not going to appreciate it, but maybe we can consider the opportunity of just phasing it and getting to your goals and getting, obviously, to the industry goals, not simply just residential, industrial, and commercial. And finally, with regards to rental housing and Section 37. With regards to rental housing, I've been before this committee, and I've said it before to individuals, staff, and yourselves. We need to bring on more rentals. We know that. And the cost of rentals is still offset by the cost of construction. Concrete has gone through the roof. Labor is going up considerably. You're not into a shortage of labor, it's just the cost of labor in construction. Some may say otherwise, that there's a shortage, and that's reflecting on the cost. So if this committee could also take into consideration that rental stock, if it's a true rental stock, should have some consideration on the DCs. And I don't mean just on the deferral agreements. And as an aside, the deferral agreements have been working great. They're getting a little bit more expensive, but maybe some type of deferral with zero interest, or maybe exempting pure rentals differently from fair market residential construction or purchases. And finally, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, Section 37. We know it's coming, and actually, I applaud it. I think if we do this right, it will be an asset similar to other municipalities who are already underway on this. But I'm a little worried, and I've had discussions with staff on this, and I'm a little worried that areas such as downtown Hamilton, where your incentive programs are starting to slow down, and rightfully so, the incentive programs will be depleted. We bring in Section 37, or they may overlap. We could have a bit of a hiccup on how affordability comes in. Section 37, in my opinion, is a good way for public good. but it's also a good way of bringing on more housing stock or any other type of development under the Act. And I think I'll leave that one as is. And if there are any questions, otherwise, again, Section 37, housing rentals, a little bit of phasing in on what you're bringing forward, consideration for infills in particular brownfields, and again, the tiering system I think is really important for the employment lands and being able to deem an office space non-commercial. Thank you.
Thanks, Serge. I have one questioner and Councillor Clark. Councillor Clark.
Thank you. Just for clarifications, because one of the challenges that this municipality has had over the many years is increasing commercial space, actual office towers, things along that line. It's been really challenging. So I was intrigued by your comment that on industrial lands or in industrial parks, if you're putting in an office in that area, you're actually charged for development charges as a commercial space, although it's an industrial. Is that what you said?
Yes. For example, I have a 6-acre parcel up in Waterdown. We're building right next to the West Cam, and we're wanting to introduce an office space. It's about 100,000 square feet. Great employment lands. It's going to be it's a jewel. But our designation is at M6, and we're being charged commercial. So our rate will be at $100,000, 100,000 square feet. Instead of being what I said was $12.53, it would be almost double, 20. It's a 40% increase. Similar to Lower Hamilton, we're doing the same thing. I just feel that we as a city are growing and growing in a fantastic mode, but we do need more office spaces. Putting office in a downtown Hamilton is fantastic, but the cost at literally $10 million an acre, that's what we're dealing with. Office space, unless you're doing massive towers, the economies of scale don't work. And that's why you see these flex spaces. That's why you see 1-floor, 2-floor buildings, and insurance companies are coming in, even medical offices and et cetera. Cheaper construction, but the DCs are a hindrance on that type of calculation. So I hope that's clear.
And you indicated that as just a municipal policy that's causing it.
Correct, and I don't want to speak on behalf of staff, but we've always kind of chuckled at this. Municipalities such as Burlington have non-residential versus residential. So then you take that and you just keep subdividing it, I would assume. But again, I don't want to speak on behalf of finance, so they can explain it.
I'll bring it up with staff later. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have no further questions at this point in time. Serge, thanks for your presentation. And I'm now going to open it up to others in the gallery who may wish to speak. I'd ask that you come down to the podium, and if you could please write your name, address, postal code, telephone number on the sheets provided. I believe that should be just next to the podium there.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Excuse me. Don McLean. I have an ongoing interest in the development charges bylaw. I sat on the stakeholder committee a number of years ago, got to know Gary and others, and got engaged in this process. So I wanted to make a few comments to you that I hope will be helpful. I want to start by a question that you may want to be asking staff and may not have thought to ask. I understand that there is a greenhouse facility in the rural area that is going to be converted to cannabis, and that you've had some significant discussions around here. I'm wondering if that's going to have any development charge impacts. It may be something that you want to look at, that we set these things up under agricultural rules, and then they get changed to rules which I think at least some of you think are not really agricultural. So that's just a small point. I'm intrigued by the grant program idea that Chair Collins has suggested, and how that might play out. It might have some opportunities to address some of the unfairness that seems to be endemic within the development charges arrangements. Much of that unfairness, I think, imposed by the province, but some of it being as a result of the way we do our development charges. I want to speak particularly to the issue of variable development charges. In this particular package that you have in front of us, there is a distinction made on stormwater fees. So that distinction means that if you are doing development in Greenfield area, the charge for a single-family home is about $9,000 higher than if you're doing that development in an infill or already built-up area. And that underlines how much variation is potentially possible if we looked at a variable development charge system that was more comprehensive than just on the issue of stormwater. Particularly, I don't yet understand why that variable development fee has not been looked at for roads. It strikes me that in the built-up area, and we can go back, it was a very simple boundary already established by the province in 2006 under the growth plan, that we have a built boundary, and within that built boundary, we've built the roads. We've built the facilities, the pipes are in place, those kinds of things are there. Beyond that built boundary, we have to build new things. And we know where those things are, and we can fairly easily calculate the cost that are associated with those expansions. So it seems to me reasonable that those charges, those costs should be allocated to the greenfield development and move us more in the direction that I know a number of councillors have been attempting to get to, of a development charge that actually reflects the cost to the municipality. Because at this point, we're in a situation where we're providing exemptions to development in some portions of the city, particularly in the downtown. And I understand the reasons for those, but those reasons are exactly the reasons why we need to have a more robust separation of charges between the greenfield and the infill areas. So I think that that's feasible and possible, and I would hope that you would see if that can be done now. It's late in the game. I know it's been raised a number of times, and I've heard some of the responses from your consultant on this, but I haven't heard a response, and I may have missed this, but I haven't heard a response specifically about the roads component, and it is the largest single component of the development charge fees. So I would suggest that that's one that you want to turn to. I want to also touch on, Councillor Clark and Councillor Wilson have both raised concerns and others about the level of poverty that we have in this community, the inequality, the economic inequality that on a not just in Hamilton, but on a certainly continental scale and to a substantial extent global scale, we're seeing dramatic increases in inequality. We're seeing situations where under 30 people now have wealth equal to more than half the world's population. And the numbers are similar in Canada, not quite as stark, but they're very high. So I think when we are looking at the way in which we operate as a community and as a public council, I think our objectives are for the public good, and that they should not be, we should be careful about how we do that in a way that might exacerbate that inequality. So the specific one that might be reconsidered within that is the significant discount that is being provided to industrial and to some extent commercial development. I understand that there's arguments about attracting jobs and attracting new industries to our community, but I also understand that the people who are doing those developments are not among the 25% of our population who are living in poverty. They're among probably the 1% or somewhere up in there. So a subsidy that is provided to the likes of our bread and wiener factories up on the mountain are subsidies really that are being paid for by people of this community and are going into the pockets of people who are much better off financially than most of this community. So I think we really need to think about why we want to continue to do those kinds of subsidies. As you know, whenever we do an exemption of any kind, we leave money on the table that we're not collecting and that we now have to collect from our residents. And in some cases, our residents, there's inequities involved in there as well that you don't need to get into in terms of development charges, thinking of things like the much higher tax rates on multi-residential facilities than there are on single-family homes. So those are points that I think might be helpful in terms of looking at this. You've been approached this morning, and I understand this evening you will be hearing from Patrick Dean, the president of the university, about the removal of the exemptions for the universities. There's interesting arguments there. But I think if we look at what we're trying to do with development charges, what a principle that underlies this is we're trying to make growth pay for itself. So in some places, in greenfield areas, that cost is pretty high. And in some cases, in downtown Hamilton, it's pretty low comparatively. So that's the reason why we need variable development fees. If we had those development fees in place, not just for stormwater, but for roads and potentially for other elements, the soft services are harder to do within that. But I think some of them could probably be allocated in that way as well. If we had that situation, those changes in the fees would benefit the universities, at least McMaster University, and I think probably it would benefit Redeemer. I believe they're within the urban boundary and probably within the built boundary, so the changes there would fall within the fees that would be applied to infill development. And as a result, and that's fair in the sense of if McMaster is putting up a new residence or new buildings, and they're within the built boundary, then many of the services that they require for those things are already in place. And to charge them a full development fee that really is a subsidy to greenfield growth is not actually fair. So that might help you address that question in a more equitable fashion. And I think staff are pretty nervous about the idea of continuing to provide an exemption for academic buildings. The numbers that turned up in the staff report were that the cost of that would be $85 million over 10 years. That's a pretty big hit, and that big hit is going to go on to the people who live in this community already as taxpayers or ratepayers. So we need to look at ways to avoid subsidies in the development charges process as much as possible. So I hope that's helpful. I would add one more thing, and it's maybe not, I'm not sure exactly how this would play out, but you recently agreed that we are in a climate emergency. And I certainly applaud that decision. One of the features of that is to start applying a climate lens to the decisions the council makes. That might have some implications in development charges, specifically for the growth into suburban areas, specifically the greenfield growth as something which has more than just direct cost implications for services provided. And I'm not sure how one would do this within the climate, applying a climate lens to that, but we want to, as much as possible, encourage whatever growth takes place to take place in an increasing intensification and density fashion, and not in something that's spreading out our transportation costs, both for public and private transportation. It might also be applicable to our parking arrangements. So we're excluding parking for some facilities, particularly we're excluding parking for new apartment buildings on the basis that that's the same as a driveway in a single-family home. Logic to that, but I think overall we want to reduce the amount of parking that's available. We want to move in a direction of moving people away from dependence on single occupancy vehicles and moving them towards situations where transit is and other options become useful to them. And we may want to look at how we can apply our development charge fees and our exemptions specifically in a way that would encourage that rather than discourage it. So those are my immediate comments to that. I'm available to take questions if you have any.
Thanks, Don, and I do have questions from Councillor Wilson.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your delegation today and your participation. You raised, through you, Mr. Chairman, the issue of roads and the application of development charges. And I think the hypothesis is that we have the means and the measures to determine when a road is built, who's using it, and for what purpose. Is that what you're suggesting?
What we have in terms of roads is we know that we have roads in place now for the population we have. And as expansion takes place, we build additional facilities. As the population goes up in the downtown, we do not expand the road system. We don't add lanes. We don't do anything in that direction. We don't have any possibilities to do that. Where we can build roads, new roads, is only in areas that are greenfields. So that's where the road component cost really needs to be applied, rather than being applied across the entire city so that the new condo development in downtown Hamilton is paying for a substantial portion of those roads. And it's not actually directly benefiting anything on those roads. There's always the argument that there is and it's built into the development charges calculations, a portion for existing use. And that's not what I'm speaking to. I'm speaking to a situation where we know where the new road development is going to have to go. If we're going to develop an area like Elfrida, we know the costs of those roads. And that's all written out. It's all in the development charge background study. We know exactly how much we're paying for those things, but we're dividing the cost of those right across the whole city rather than where the real cost is being incurred and where the real benefit is being acquired by those greenfield developments. The reality is we're in a situation as a community of being very far behind in maintaining our existing infrastructure. The numbers staff are using at this point is $3.5 billion behind. I think one of the main reasons we got into that situation, and one of the things we need to change in order to avoid getting deeper into that situation, is we allowed low density, you call it sprawl, whatever you want to call it, suburban development, which required a higher level of services per unit and a higher cost, therefore, and that cost is being imposed on the whole community. We know that the studies have been done everywhere across the GTA and Golden Horseshoe, that sprawl development is much more expensive for municipalities. So we have to find a way to get out of that hole, and if we're going to get out of that hole, we have to stop making the same mistakes that we made in the past. They weren't necessarily conscious mistakes at that point, but we now know that when you have 30 units per hectare versus 80 units per hectare, it's much more expensive per unit in the 30 unit per hectare area, or the 20 unit per hectare, or the half-acre lots, or whatever. Does that answer your question?
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chairman. It certainly does. And a few of us have met with the consultant and staff, and I'll only speak to myself out of that group, trying to, I was of the impression that there should be, or there could be, an easy causality measured. If you're building a road out to a greenfield, we have trip generation measures to discern. That is not a benefit to existing. That is a benefit strictly to those who are going to be living in that particular development. And as a consequence, why can't we price it as such? And so I do not lose the answer in translation. Through you, Mr. Chairman, if I could ask Gary to provide an explanation of why are we limited in trying to apply what I think would be a common sense approach, but not so common sense.
Gary?
Through the chair. With respect to roads, probably one of the first items is the fact that when you've undertaken a transportation master plan, you've taken a look at more of a global look at the road system and have applied the growth across the whole municipality. We get into things such as modal splits and such. We don't have the data in order to support justifying what I would say going to the Ontario Municipal Board, or ALPAT, as I guess it's ALPAT now. Having the information in order to sustain, I should put 100% of this road to this particular area and 95%. And part of the problem with roads is that it's a very fluid movement. You know, you have, even though you have residents at one area, you have all these different service industries that are moving across all of the road system to come in and service your particular home. I mean, you've got you know, UPS deliveries, you've got plumbers, you've got electricians, you've got your bell. So it's also the fact that it's difficult to isolate half of your travel movement where it's coming from in order to service you. So there's a number of different factors that has to be taken into consideration. What we did talk with the councillor is if it is possible to put that out and to be able to discern some level of differential through the next transportation master plan and through grids 2. I think that would probably be good to express. I just don't have the data right now in order for this study, in order to even start to discern different areas. So I think as we noted, with grids 2, I think it would be good to see if through, you know, the transportation modeling, we might be able to discern. Maybe we can vary it by 10% higher here and 10% lower here. But I haven't got the data to basically feel confident in recommending to the city that we move forward in that area.
Thank you, Gary. You are much more eloquent in summarizing what you were explaining to me much earlier in this council term. So I just wanted to highlight that those conversations have been had, and those are the answers that were received. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And thank you, Gary, for that explanation. And I assume that at this point in the process, we're going to have a hard time changing that for this round. I do remind committee that the development charges bylaw, while it has to be renewed every 5 years, can be renewed more frequently. So if we were able to move in those directions, we could achieve some of those objectives in a shorter time period than what we might do in terms of waiting for another 5 years for another development charges bylaw.
Thanks, Don. I have questions from Councillor Clark.
It was actually to Mr. McLean's last point that I was going to ask, because my understanding of the Development Charges Act is that municipalities can actually change the development charges midstream, if you will, provided there's a public comment period and we follow the prescriptions from the Act. So can I just get clarification perhaps from you and then also from staff?
That's my understanding, but staff is going to be much more.
What's the actuals, Mr. Chairman, in terms of public notice? If you were to do this, say, 2.5 years after we've passed this, we now decide to go to a variable rate for greenfields and a different rate for built-up DCs.
Yeah. So through the chair, under that scenario, we would conduct whatever amendments to master plans, and whether it involves grids 2 as well. We would reconvene the DC stakeholder committee and bring all that information forward, and then we would go through a similar process as this. There would be a 60-day consultation process, And I believe this current bylaw reads up to 5 years because staff do recognize that the land budget, which the province is working towards, may affect an update to this bylaw prior to the end of 5 years.
Yeah, so we actually have a few challenges with the province currently because they are changing growth plans. They are changing the land budget numbers. We have not completed the grids process. We have not completed the municipal comprehensive review. So we have a number of areas where we really don't know where the urban boundary expansion is going to happen. And yet in this document for the DCs, we have a specific area where it seems to all have been piled in. At some point, if the numbers change, we have to change the DCs anyways, because Elfrida won't be where all the development happens. So quite clearly that may happen regardless.
Yeah, so through the chair, if there are changes in supply and demand, so in terms of demand as in population and where that population may be cited, that would affect a change in the supply, which would be the background study and the DC rates.
And I'm feeling awkward here because I'm asking questions of staff, Mr. Chairman, but we have a guest here, so should I wait until Mr. McLean takes his seat? Chair? Thank you. And so I'm trying to understand then in the development charges, and it struck me as odd how we had a number of roads, number of pipelines and things like that that were being accounted for through the Elfrida area based on the Elfrida development, and yet we had not completed grids and we had not completed the municipal comprehensive review. So how did we actually come to those numbers being added to the development charge capital list when council has not made the decision to actually expand the urban boundary through Elfrida? Not sure how it happened. I'm trying to understand it.
So through the chair, I'll start, and then maybe Jason and Gary can add in. What you do see before you is a continuation. Those projects for that specific part of the city were identified, I believe, 2009 and 2014. And as the councillors identified, the approach that staff have taken was, given that the previous council had adopted that area as it relates to a growth plan area, is that those projects were earmarked as servicing related to demand. And I think it's best that I pass it on to Jason and to Gary to speak to how we identified a envelope of funding level as it relates to those servicing needs.
And if you can, Mr. Thorne, speak to the fact, because I recall the passage of the urban official plan, and I recall very clearly that I had the amendment added to it that prior to that the urban boundary expansion in Elfrida could not happen without a municipal comprehensive review taking place first. So it's not complete yet, and yet all of these financial numbers are in this capital charge, so I'm struggling to understand the process.
Yeah, so through the chair, so the projects identified in the DC bylaw flow from the various master plans that were prepared by staff. Those master plans flow from the OP as it was adopted, which flows from the grids process. So these are the DC is a continuation of the implementation of that the original grids work. The councillor whose early comment is correct that if there are changes that happen in the future that change either the growth quantum or the growth locations, then that would then trickle back down to changes to those master plans and changes to a future DC bylaw. What you have in front of you right now in terms of the background study is based on the master plans that have been approved to date, which flow from the original grids work.
So, and to be fair, the original grids work indicated that Elfrida may be a future urban boundary expansion, but the actual direction through the official plan was you can't proceed with it until you complete the comprehensive review and the second grid, and you can't complete the comprehensive review until you complete grids 2, and grids 2 isn't complete. So you can see my conundrum when I'm looking at hundreds of millions of dollars of DCs and capital being in this list, and yet we have not got close to the point where we would be saying, okay, here's where we're going and here's all the houses that are going here.
Yeah, so through the chair, ultimately, the urban boundary expansion would have to proceed. The secondary planning work would have to proceed before any of these projects become reality.
So the fact that they're there, they're in essence place markers because we haven't finalized and made the decision. Is that correct, Mr. Zagarek?
So through the chair, that's correct. And whether or not ultimately those that demand is driven in that particular part of the city or elsewhere, it's a placeholder, and those costs will be incurred as it relates to the soft services the councillor made reference to fire suppression and fire prevention, whether it's rec centers or libraries. Those demands will be there as population grows and as our citizens demand those services. And again, in part as a placeholder, and as that information gets further refined through the subsequent studies, is the background study will reflect that.
And there's no doubt when I read the capital list, there are clearly projects there that right now, based on the increase in population, which has been rather significant, the demands are there for those services now. So I have no doubt that that's there, but I'm glad we're all on the same page in terms of how we're moving forward. So to be clear then, the discussion on a variable rate for greenfields and a different rate for the built-up area, it would be challenging within this, because we're now 30 days into a 60-day comment period. It would be incredibly challenging for the municipality to modify or amend it in that manner in the next 35 days or so. Can I get just some affirmation, or am I completely off my rocker?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'd concur. Within 30 days, it would be next to impossible for us to adjust it. And if you did, I think kind of the rule of thumb is charges are going up in certain areas, then you'd have to have another public meeting, which restarts a process. So we don't have the background study to support the next public meeting. So difficult. However, as I say, with the going through grids or any other initiatives, we can come back and revisit the bylaw at any time during the 5-year life.
And so it would be my understanding that when we complete, because it's not if, it's when we complete Grids 2, which is well underway, and when we subsequently do the land budget and subsequently complete the municipally initiated comprehensive review, we would have a very clear indication at that point where any urban boundary expansion would be across the city, and we could then look at a variable rate based on the outcomes of those 3 studies. Is that accurate?
For you, Mr. Chair, yes, it is.
Okay, thank you, and I appreciate that, because that gives us some indication. If there is the political will here, that's how we can do it, but it's not going to be exactly timely, because we have to wait for those studies to come back through the planning process. Thank you very much, I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your latitude.
Yep, thanks, Councillor Clark. Don, no further questions at this point in time.
Thanks very much.
For the presentation today, appreciate that. I'm going to call again to the public to see if there are any other speakers. Linda, if you want to make your way down, that'd be great. Thank you.
Morning.
Write your contact information there at the.
I've already done that. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My comments are going to be very brief here, I guess almost this afternoon now. Just wanted to come up and just share some perspectives that Environment Hamilton has around the importance of development charges and getting it right. And I want to step back and just take you back to 2010 when a GTA planner named Dr. Pamela Blay published a book called Perverse Cities. And I think it's a really important exploration of essentially why there's an argument to be made that planning policy alone isn't enough to get us to where we need to go. And Dr. Blay took a look at the fact that despite there being a growth plan and despite there being efforts to try at the municipal level to curb urban sprawl in many ways, that those planning policies alone aren't good enough. And what she really pointed to is the fact that we've got this system of providing services that involves in many municipalities, and I think Hamilton is no exception, we've been averaging costs right across the municipality instead of recognizing the fact that providing services is more expensive in some areas than others. So pleased to see that there's been some conversation today on the stormwater front about acknowledging those differences. But I guess the messages would really urge you check out Dr. Blai's book for one, so that you can understand why this is so important, but also to do what you can moving forward to really get a handle on how do we reconfigure the system so that we do get the costs right. And I think part of Dr. Blai's argument is that if you do get the costs right, then on the planning side, those policies are going to function far more effectively. You're going to get to the point where you see that development of complete communities within the built-up area, all of those things become, I'm not going to say easier, but more likely to happen because you're paying attention to the economics of growth and the cost of growth and how that cost varies depending on whether you're continually building outwards or you're paying attention to intensification within the urban boundary. So that's really all I wanted to say today, was to point that out and to help you to see that there are people out there who've looked at this in detail and have really pointed to that importance of development charges. And I think, if anything, again, I know Don already made reference to the climate emergency and declaration of that emergency and looking at these issues through a climate lens. And I think this is an important one to think about because urban form has huge implications for greenhouse gas emissions. Again, I would argue that the city is at the front lines of the climate crisis, and as a municipality, this is something that you have the power to make decisions on and change over time. So just leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. I have no speakers at this point in time. Thanks for your presentation. Yep. Any other speakers? Please come down to the podium. Good afternoon.
My name is Gail McKeegan, and I live in Ward 1, Maureen Wilson's ward. And I just want to thank Brad Clark and Maureen for mentioning that there are 25% of the taxpayers that really struggle to pay any tax increase. And so I have to identify myself, as hard as it is, as one of those people that's really struggling. And just wanted to say that I want you to keep in mind, like I do when I redo my budget, ongoing budget changes, that some of the little things that I do to save money is I had to go from getting my spec delivered to getting it online and going to Starbucks. Is it worth it to pay for a coffee to sit there and be able to read the paper online? Can I afford to get my dog his flea and tick medicine, or can I just keep him in the backyard and not take him to the dog park and maybe he won't be as much at risk? Can I buy that will last me for 3 dinners so that I can pay my taxes, which are up to date? And I'm very proud of that because that's how I was brought up, to budget and live within my budget. And I just want to ask the people here if they would keep a lot of people like me in mind that are on a fixed income. And as the prices go up, I have to go without something. And I have to think every time, what is it that I can let go this time? What can I cut back on? So I really hope that you all think the same when you're thinking about the increases to the taxes. Thanks a lot. It's hard to say. I'm a nervous wreck. I don't like to admit that.
I just want to thank you for coming forward. You're not alone.
No, I know.
You said there's 25% of the residents in our community are really struggling to pay their taxes. We do have programs available to help folks who are in that situation. But hearing the choices that you're struggling to make, it really comes home to a lot of people out there who do they pay their hydro bill or do they eat and take their medicine, or do they forego their medicine because they can't pay for their medicine? You mentioned about, does your dog get your flea and tick medicine? Those are real life decisions that folks who are struggling have to make every single day.
Have to make them.
And we kind of forget it sometimes here when we're dealing with multi-million-dollar budgets and folks are coming down here asking us to exempt them from development charges because they're going to have a difficult time. When we do that, we're putting it on the backs of people like you.
And it's people, I think sometimes people, I feel like they sometimes lump you into like, well, you know what, how did you get in that position? But I worked for 50 years. I'm retired now, and I thought I'd be okay on my retirement money. But I'm taking money out of my RRSPs to pay my taxes, and that's fine. I can do that. That's what they're there for emergency. But you know what? It's kind of tough when I just keep on going down. And people say, well, sell your house. Well, I worked all my life to be able to live in my own house. So I feel like I come to you guys to say, please, keep in mind that not everybody can afford these increases, and it's really up to you guys to try to think about us when it comes to those times.
And
I'm gonna come and see you.
I'd encourage you
I'm not
to
asking, I don't wanna ask for anything, except just that you keep us in mind.
do sit down with Councillor Wilson, because there are programs available for people on fixed income who are struggling to pay their taxes, to forego that so that you have a little bit of extra money to pay some of the things.
I understand, but you know what, there's a lot of people that are in
Oh, I know.
more need than me, but I don't wanna have to go to the food bank because I would feel that that was a real failure on my part of being able to manage my money and be able to pay my way. So, you know, I know there's things out there, but I feel like I should be able to pay my way, and I'm just asking that you guys keep people like me in mind.
I appreciate your courage for coming forward. Thank you.
Councillor Pearson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I certainly appreciate the residents' comments, and I certainly agree. I think we all hear this when we're knocking on doors at election time. And as I whispered to Councillor Clark as he was talking to her that, you know, in my ward, it's been issues where residents said, you know, do I buy my medicine or do I pay my taxes? And it is a difficult balancing act, especially when, you know, residents who've worked over 50 years, but, you know, whatever they're getting in pension is not near what people may get today when they retire, so they're in that box. And it's not easy. But one point I also want to make, and suggestions, very cautious, people say, well, you know, you can just sell your house. Just evaluate what it costs you to operate your house to what it would cost you to rent every month. I am a landlord, I want to be careful, but believe me, I tell residents of my ward, if your house is paid off and you're paying taxes, you're far better off to stay in your house than to start all over again and now be in a situation where you're going to spend a lot more money. So just putting that out there.
Thanks, Gail. Do we have any other speakers who'd like to present this afternoon? Of course, we do have an evening session. Anyone else? Going once, twice, 3 times? I need a motion now to receive the presentations from earlier this morning and this afternoon, moved by Councillor Clark, seconded by Councillor Ferguson. All those in favor? Carries, thank you. And now we're going to recess this portion of the meeting until this evening because we do have other presenters, and we will... need to go on to, we're recessing the public delegation portion, we do have a number of written submissions in front of us, and I will entertain a motion to receive those at this point in time. Moved by Clark, seconded by Johnson. All those in favor? That carries, thank you. Now we're moving on to 9.1, which is the tax and rate operating budget variance report as at December 31st, 2018. And Brian is here to present on that. Brian, the floor is yours. Heard something about make it snappy, but I'm all right.
So through the chair, I'd like to thank the councillors and the member of the committee for listening to my presentation today after a fairly long morning. So what I'm going to present today is the operating budget variance report for year end, the unaudited one. So our auditors are on site, and they'll be reviewing any adjustments that are needed in the financial statements, and if anything's required, we would bring that back to committee. We've presented previously on our variance forecasts back at Audit, Finance, and Meng Committee in September and in July, and just March 22nd, Mike Zagar gave a bit of an update on the on the year-end variance, and indicated that I'd be making a presentation, and mine's a little longer than Mike's was. So what I'm going to go through today is the summary of the variance, and then specifically the tax-supported operating variance explanations, and then the rate-supported variance explanations, and the surplus disposition recommendations, and that's on the the tax-supported operating budget variance. So as this was in there was a report that you received as well in your agenda package, SCS 18067B. This chart is in that package, and what this highlights is the surplus by tax-supported programs and rate-supported programs, and the consolidated surplus of the $24.8 million at the bottom of page 3. I'll get into some specifics in a few minutes, but that's the summary of where we ended up for 2018 year end. So this part of the presentation, I'm going to break it into the city departments, then I'll go into the capital financing and
Brian,
and
sorry
boards
for
and
interrupting. Folks, can we keep it down to a low roar, please? Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Go ahead.
So regarding the city departments, and within the city departments, we also lump in the corporate financials and the non-program revenues, which are not department specific, but they're more citywide. We lump those in as well. So overall, the variance there for year end was a $4.5 million surplus, or about 0.9% on the $523 million budget. So relatively relatively close to the budget. Last year, in case you're interested, that number was $18.3 million in the 2017 year end surplus. The next few slides, we're going to go through some of the variances by department. So planning and economic development, $1.3 million favorable variance. We've highlighted 3 of the divisions here: transportation planning and parking division, growth management, and the tourism and culture division. Obviously, of course, there's other divisions in that department. We're going to highlight these 3. So transportation planning and parking division, a favorable variance of $843,000, mainly due to some higher revenues, gapping surplus, and some of the efficiencies in the department in the contractual and building services. For the growth management, there was a gapping surpluses for staff of $458,000, some savings in computer software, and then we had some increased airport revenues, and some recoveries from capital, and some savings in administrative expenses. So an overall surplus there of $310,000. The tourism and culture division had a $129,000 unfavorable variance, and a lot of that was related to gapping pressures of $581,000 unfavorable. Some higher revenues and federal grants offset some of that deficit, and then some additional savings in contractual services, the grounds and building costs of $216,000. Some of the other divisions, licensing and bylaw, had favorable variances. That was probably the major other variance in that area. Overall, each of the departments has a gapping target. So previously, we would have budgeted the gapping target at a corporate level. In 2018, we moved that out to the department. So the gapping target for planning and economic development was $776,000. They achieved that and had an actual surplus of $713,000 over and above their gapping target. So that's a result of primarily a result of a lot of vacancies and positions that maybe were difficult to fill. Healthy and safe communities, $3.2 million favorable variance. A number of the divisions are highlighted here. Long-term care division. So some of their favorable variance was related to the subsidies. Again, some gapping. There were some hydro savings. The Ontario Works division, subsidy of $476,000 contributed to the surplus and gapping. At the housing division, there was available subsidy of $212,000 they were able to utilize. There's some year-end reconciliations, annual information returns that stands for, and related to rents, the rent geared to income and property taxes and mortgage. So that saved the city $3 million, and that's gone to the reserve. That was offset by some housing allowances. And you may also recall that there was a report that was written to transfer rent geared to income subsidy programs, transfer that to the tax stabilization reserve earlier. So that was done in early or late 2018. So that money is going to be available in the tax stabilization reserve to be spent over the next 5 years, beginning in 2019. Public health services, there was some additional subsidy of $680,000 and some gapping. And fire, savings in employee-related costs, savings in utilities, and some facilities costs offset some of those other surpluses. Paramedics had an unfavorable variance of $1.9 million. So they had employee-related costs of $1.3 million over budget. The ministry funding not received was $402,000, and the increased medical supplies cost of $352,000. So with the paramedics, some of it's the way that we chose to introduce our programs, and in previous years we might have introduced the paramedic program. The funding, there's a lag in the funding. So what we do is we said we're not going to fund that from our tax stabilization reserve. We'll see how that plays out. The paramedics chief was having meetings with the province to see whether some of that funding would be covered, and it did not come through. Overall, so Healthy and Safe Communities had a gapping target of $866,000, and they met their target as well with a gapping number of $2.4 million. And that's built into a lot of the division that I mentioned there. Public Works, unfavorable variance of $1.7 million, primarily attributable to transit, gapping pressure of $1.6 million, so that's related to vacation payouts, legislative personal emergency leave days, overtime, sick time, so they had a pressure of $1.6 million. DART's contract pressure was $300,000. Those are the primary two reasons for their variance. Energy, Fleet, and Facilities, a $1.8 million unfavorable variance. So pressures in payroll-related costs. Central Fleet, their staff shortages, didn't allow them to bill some additional costs back to the other departments. Vacant Facilities, savings of $300,000, and then golf courses had a loss of $302,000. Environmental Services, $268,000, unfavorable variance. Contractual costs, the incentive for the payment for the landfill, and then higher operating costs for parks and cemeteries, and they had favorable gapping, though, of $1.5 million to offset some of those other items. Engineering Services, $1.4 million favorable, and that's primarily due to the street lighting program and the corridor management program revenue. Transportation Operations and Maintenance, a favorable variance of $763,000, mainly gapping of $1.9 million, and offset by some recoveries of $1.2 million. Gapping targets in Public Works. So their target was $2 million, and they had gapping of $3.5 million. So there's a surplus in gapping overall in the overall department of $1.5 million. This slide number 9, highlights the variances by some of the corporate services and legislative divisions. So legislative overall had savings from some consulting and contractual, city manager's office, some savings in HR, and gapping, corporate services, a favorable variance, a lot of it from gapping, and then also some higher revenues. And IT, so there's some IT savings as well. Corporate financials, unfavorable variance of $200,000, but like there was a lot of it was related to WSIB claims payouts, but there were savings from lower insurance claims, and then some additional interest income and other miscellaneous adjustments, other financial adjustments. Non-program revenues, there's a deficit of $476,000 overall. A lot of it related to the general revenues. So the timing of the HUC dividends, we made a projection based on information that we received from HUC and Electra, but the timing of the payments are affected. So the last payment comes in March 2019, not in December 2018, as we'd expected. So that caused an impact on the year-end numbers. And there's a surplus in some of the tax revenue. So at GIC yesterday, we highlighted that in one of our reports about some of the increases in the tax revenues. And the Hamilton entertainment facilities. So we have the contract with Global Spectrum, so we have higher contract revenues that we received in the order of about $665,000. So that contributed to that surplus of $464,000, and that was offset by primarily by some additional facilities costs. Now, so now it's just the boards and agencies and the capital financing to round out the tax operating budget surplus. On the capital financing, $5.1 million surplus, so that's related to lower debt charges due to when we budget our debt, and we haven't issued it yet. You may recall our capital financing plan for the 2019 capital budget. We also had another $5 million in there that we used in the financing capital financing plan to allow us to increase our investment in infrastructure. Boards and agencies, I'll start at the bottom. Police services, $1.1 million surplus. That goes to a reserve according to the reserve policy that the police has. They'll go back to their board and they'll recommend to their board whether it goes to tax stabilization reserve or whether they use it for other purposes. Similarly with library, their variance we're aware of is primarily related to gapping. Farmers market as well, so they have a policy where they put their money in a reserve, and that's been improved by or forwarded onto council as well. So, and then NPCA, that results in the $2.4 million unfavorable variance in from NPCA. You're aware of that. You're aware of that issue. That continues an ongoing pressure, and we continue to budget the apportionment levies that we've feel that we should be paying. That in that judicial file, that judicial review is still under in progress, and we're paying these amounts under protest. Regarding the salary and wage gapping, you may have heard me mention a few of them back. So overall, the gapping savings were it was $4.5 million across all of the departments, and we achieved $9.3 million. So an overall surplus of $4.8 million across the departments through various divisions. So regarding the rate operating budget, so the variance forecast, the rate operating budget, we've broken it down by their operating expenses, separate from the capital financing and the reserve impacts, and then the revenue. So this year, a $16.5 million surplus. So primarily, I'll go back on this one, sorry. So on the operating expenses, again, that'll be that's the next slide. But on the capital financing in particular, it's similar to on the tax-supported operating budget side. It's related to the timing of when we issue our debt. So we plan to issue our debt, a lot of it in 2018 as well. And so if we don't incur those debt charges, then we have budget savings in that $2.6 million. Then through the process, you'll see that it'll go back to reserves. On the rate revenue side, we're realizing about a $1.4 million surplus. Not significant really when you consider the $207 million, $208 million budget. So a variance of 0.7, not a huge number. And then the non-rate revenue, smaller, unfavorable variance, but on a smaller base. Regarding the operating expenses, really for the rate-supported budget. So this covers all the water, wastewater, and stormwater operations. So there's variances in the contractual services, as you can see. That's one of the bigger items. So that would have been largely due to the water distribution system contract. Some work not completed, so not having to be paid out. Utility locate contract, about $1.4 million. Some of it's related to the biosolids. The employee-related costs there, savings of $3.3 million. So that'll be related to the gapping as well. So the gapping numbers I showed you a minute ago were related to the tax operating budget, not the rate-supported budget. And those are some of the main highlights. So regarding the recommendation, so in the report, we have a table 1, and you've received a new page, a new yellow page showing what the revised table is, and it was just a minor correction. So when we're looking at what the recommendations are for this report, so we have a policy that says the year-end surplus for the tax operated budget go to the tax stabilization reserve, but we also have authority, council's authority to make changes to that and put the money in different places. So we look at our liabilities, our commitments, our obligations, and we make recommendations in that report of where we think that money should go. So one of the things that you've heard about just a few minutes ago, and you continue to hear about, is the development charges. Last year, you may recall, we transferred I think it was about $8 million to the development charges reserves to look after some of the unfunded exemptions. So the 6-year total right now is 66 million. That number was essentially the same last year because some of the funding and some of the exemptions that went through this year. So what we're recommending in the report is to transfer a portion of the surplus, 538,630, to the non-res roads DC reserve. And then for the rate-supported DC reserves, we're going to suggest transferring another $2.7 million. So I'll talk about the surplus first and then get to Appendix C. So as I just to highlight, so the surplus overall for the tax supported was the $8.3 million. So that the boards and agencies, the police, the library, and the farmers market, there's authority to transfer money to their reserves of $1.1 million in that table. So the balance of the surplus, the capital financing number, so the $5 million, we're recommending that it be transferred to the unallocated capital levy reserve, and that'll be used for future investment as well. So we've used that money. It was raised for the purposes of capital, and now we're suggesting that we put it back, and we've been doing that as a past practice as well. The Flamborough Capital Reserve, so from our slot revenue, there's a $346,000 surplus from the slot revenues this year, and similar to what we did last year, we transferred that to the Flamborough Capital Reserve. I just mentioned the non-residential roads DC reserve, $538,000. And then Hamilton Entertainment Facilities, there's some challenges with that, with those facilities, and we have a future need as well for a pending investment. So we're suggesting transferring that surplus that in the Hamilton Entertainment Facilities, transfer that to the Capital Projects Reserve. And then in Fire's case, though, Fire has presented their vehicle reserve, and it has some challenges in the future. So we're recommending that $725,000 go to the Fire Reserve. So there's a number of other liabilities and pressures that we have. So obviously a number of departments, a number of services have requirements, but those are the ones that we felt were we could specifically identify where the surplus would go. So we didn't put any money then into the tax stabilization reserve. So the tax stabilization reserve has a target balance of $34.8 million. It's sitting at about $12 million right now. We've made some other commitments recently. The housing benefit money went in, and it's going to be going back out. So that tax stabilization reserve is something that we won't be able to draw on much in the future because it is getting down to a low balance below the target that we had set. Regarding the rate operating surplus, so the water program, the surplus will go to the water reserve. The wastewater program will go to the waste reserve. But then the other remaining two, we have the deficit in the DC reserve related to the rate reserves is about $2.7 million. So we're transferring that money to the DC rate reserve. And the top recommendation there talks about the complement transfer. So within our budget complement control policy, when we're moving resources between divisions, we put a schedule in the report and ask for approval to move those resources between divisions at no cost. And that is it. So if you have any questions, I'm sure we can help answer those questions. So.
We do have a speakers list, Brian, and I'll start with Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to compliment both the councillors and the staff. The surplus or the reserves they're in actually pretty healthy shape. You've done a marvelous job over the last while to get them there, because I can recall a time where they were rather low and we were nervous about having them so low. So it takes a great deal of discipline to find the savings and efficiencies to ensure that we can actually put the reserves in that position. Two questions. One is with regards to all of the announcements that we're seeing from this budget that just keeps on taking. Public health, $200 million reduction, paramedics, an ambulance, library, conservation authorities. So how are we looking at these things and preparing contingencies? Because it's happening in year, which is really challenging for us because our budget is already approved. Tax notification's gone out, the policies are passed. So how do we prepare and to cover some of these costs?
Yeah, so through the chair, maybe I'll start first though, and then Mike can jump in. So yeah, so I've asked those questions, same sort of thing. So specifically when we had some, you may have seen some additional or maximizing provincial subsidies in some of those, one of the charts related to healthy and safe communities. So there's particular pressures in healthy and safe communities, and we were able to get some additional funds last year in 2018. So we're very careful when we're budgeting in 2019 about using the 2018 levels. So potentially there is going to be a pressure. Paramedics is the one where it's a lot of unknowns, and the way that the process has worked in the past, where we approve something in the one year and then we ask for the subsidy in the subsequent year. Correct. Just the way that process works. So we're expecting that they're going to continue to fund some of these enhancements that we put in place in the past. So yeah, as was mentioned at GIC yesterday, yeah, we're continuing to monitor the situation, and we'll be staying on top of it. I don't know, Mike, if you want to.
So through the chair, I think the key word Brian used is unknowns. There are a lot of unknowns as to what the proposed changes will represent in 2019, this fiscal year for municipalities. And we will be tracking what those potential changes are. I think to Councillor Clark's question is how we would approach it is once we have better information with respect to what the local impact is, we would come forward to council with two short-term options. Typically, one is some mitigating measures if there's an ability to mitigate in year and not cause potential year-end pressures. In the case where those potential year-end pressures cannot be mitigated, is we would recommend a reserve to get us through 2019 and then come forward through the 2020 budget with further discussions on some mitigating measures. So again, a bit early as it relates to not having a lot of details, and I believe the paramedics issue that Brian is highlighting might be aligned to the additional service enhancement and the fact that the province waits a full fiscal year before it cost shares with the municipality that enhancement. So it's a bit of a lag. I think Brian used the word lag. There's a 1-year lag typically. Now that was the previous government and previous practice, so that as well is something that we'll need to better understand as council has continued the strategy as it relates to enhancing paramedic services. Is that commitment to 50-50 funding going to be a practice of this provincial government?
Yeah, it'd be great if they decide to just upload it and make it their whole thing, but I think there'll be some fallout somewhere if they choose to do that. The NPCA levy decision, have we heard anything from the judge yet?
Through the chair, I haven't received an update yet, and what I've asked Cindy and for staff just to confirm, because if I recall correctly, because of the commissioner's decision, we had to appeal the other conservation authorities. So we likely have some financial pressures in our year end as it relates to the other conservation, and I just don't want to be silent on it, in that our year end would reflect not only MPCA but the other conservation authorities whose levies we've had to appeal. And what you see is, while we are appealing them, we have an obligation to pay, and we are paying in protest. But to the question, I haven't seen an update recently, but I will follow up with legal services.
And so then the last question is, received notice that we've been served. This is a better Niagara. They're now going to court to ensure that Niagara Region gets 12 members on the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority, which would really undercut us dramatically, given that the Conservation Authorities Act says it's 5 for Niagara, 4 for Hamilton, and 2 for Haldimand. That court hearing is May 13th, so have we had an opportunity to meet with legal, and are we coming back to council or committee to address this issue? Because it's going to come up quickly, and I know we didn't get much time. They always seem to serve us right around, last time it was Christmas, this time it was Easter. I'm sure it's just a religious thing and has nothing to do with short notice.
So through the chair, is I can ask legal. Legal has been reviewing the issue as it relates to governance and representation. We can bring back a previous, I believe we did a previous report with respect to the act and the regulations. And just a commentary, I find it interesting when the city argued that the act supersedes the regulations, and that was disputed. That now other parties are suggesting when it comes to governance that the act does supersede the regulations. So there seems to be some inconsistency with respect to the validity of the act versus the regulations from the other parties.
I'm not going to comment because I try to work with these folks. But ultimately, we as a council has taken the position 5-4-2. We need to make sure that we have our legal defense there, because if we're not there, they'll just make a decision in our absence.
So through the chair, we have been consistent. We took the position with respect to the levy that the act supersedes the regulation, and similarly, we'll report back as to what the act speaks to when it comes to governance and representation.
Thank you. That's the only concern that I have right now. So again, this is an excellent report. Thank you.
Councillor Ferguson.
Yeah, Mike, can you go to slide 11, but you're not, yeah, you are. The NCPA, the Niagara Peninsula Conservation Authority, this $2.4 million, you're now taking that out of operating. We've been paying that under protest out of reserves. Why are you not suddenly taking it out of our year-end surplus rather than continue with reserves, because we fully expect to get it returned?
So through the chair is, this is a practice that we've had in previous years, is it's coming out of the operating budget, not out of the surplus, not out of the reserves. In effect, if we flowed that money into a reserve, it would flow into the tax stabilization reserve, and we would fund the 2.4 million out of the tax stabilization reserve. My point being, it has the same impact. So again, we are just simply funding it out of the surplus. The alternative would be to send that surplus, that 2.4 million, into the tax stabilization reserve and then funding it out of the tax.
No, I get that, but so I'm wrong then. We haven't been paying it out of reserves up to now. You've been taking it out of year-end surpluses.
Through the chair, that's correct.
Okay. If you go to slide 18. Ward 12 now encompasses a good chunk of Flamborough, and it got transferred into the Flamborough Capital Reserve. Can you just remind me, I've never paid attention to it because I never represented Flamborough before. What's that used for, and how much of that fund is available to Ward 12 now?
So through the chair, that was a reserve that would have been part of the amalgamation with the new city of Hamilton. I don't know what the original balance started at, but yeah, so it would have been shared between the Flamborough councillors, and I think Councillor Partridge would like to speak about it. So I'm not sure what the current balance is right now, Mike.
A big chunk of Flamborough is now in Ward 12, so I thought that they get it higher a bit.
I think Councillor Partridge just said it's all spoken for, but continue asking your questions.
Well, I think that, Flamborough is now part of Ward 12. So what happened?
Go ahead, Councillor. So through the chair, there isn't very much, this will represent the majority of the balance. The fund has been leveraged over the last number of years, and so there isn't a significant uncommitted balance in it. It does, as Brian's made reference, it is a carryover from pre-amalgamation, so it is all Flamborough. In the past, the ward councillors have worked collaboratively in terms of identifying projects that are eligible. And so again, there isn't a current allocation methodology. It's not allocated amongst the ward councillors based on population or based on area. Right now, it is a joint and shared reserve. And again, subject to further direction, is that would continue unless we were directed to report back on distributing that reserve out to the affected wards.
Okay, so now that Flamborough has been divided into Ward 12, Ward 13, and Ward 15, so those three councillors then would have a discussion on how to spend that $345,000?
Through the chair, that's correct. It's a shared reserve.
You just divide it by 3? What?
So that is.
Mr. Chairman, I'm trying to ask the staff a question.
So through the chair, that's, that is a decision that those ward councillors, we would expect that conversation with the ward councillors. If staff were directed to distribute that out in some way, we could report back on options. But to date, the practice has been the ward councillors have worked collaboratively as it relates to identifying projects.
So I can expect staff then to call a meeting of the 3 affected ward councillors to have a discussion about this?
So through the chair, unless we are directed otherwise, my answer would be no. That is not part of our work plan for the reserve reports. But again, if we were to be directed to report back with options, we would.
Okay, this is brand new to me because it's brand new to my area. Councillor Partridge here is being way too defensive here. It sounds like she wants to take it all, or is planning to take it all. Well, I don't know why she's making so much noise then.
I think I heard her say Councillor Pursuta has spent most of the money, so she has nothing to blame for Councillor Partridge. Go ahead, Councillor.
I didn't hear your comment, Mr. Chairman, because I was being overspoken by a couple people beside me.
Go ahead.
What was your point?
No, floor is yours. Go ahead. I was just joking.
So I'm looking for some advice on, because I'm new at this, to get educated on how we do this.
I think traditionally what Mike has just referenced, and it will exist in other wards as well, and we have a situation with our Terrapure Reserve and 3 Stony Creek wards. It's up to the ward councillors to come together and come up with some kind of either a formal policy or an unwritten policy in terms of how you deal with those expenditures on a future basis. So I believe, not to speak for my colleagues, but in the Stony Creek area, we were looking at divvying it up based on population. And so that's an option for Flamborough in terms of looking at your percentage of population and then drawing on the reserve to that amount, or work informally as.
Or just divide it by 3.
Those are your options.
Okay, I don't know what next steps are because staff don't want to engage in this, so.
So through the chair, we're in the hands of committee. As Councillor Collins has identified, these are carryovers from pre-amalgamation. So any former municipalities that encompass multiple wards will have this situation. So I think Councillor Ferguson, this is new to Councillor Ferguson, because the former Ancaster Reserve would have been available to him previously as it relates to his representation. So we have this situation as it relates to Stony Creek, Hamilton, Flamborough, those former municipalities that encompass multiple wards, and now because of the ward realignment, it could encompass parts of different former municipalities. We're in the hands of committee as it relates to those reserves, or whether the councillors
encourage you to take and replenish that by $345,000.
Through the chair, it's a policy. So council approved a policy. It's been amended from time to time. I believe at one point it was 50% going to the Flamborough Reserve, 50% towards net levy reductions. That was then amended.
This is slot revenue, isn't it?
Anything that is over and above the budget. So we budget for slot revenues. If actuals exceed budget, the surplus goes to the Flamborough Reserve.
Okay, so I got to arm wrestle with my 2 colleagues, and you're being way too defensive, Councillor Partridge, on this thing. I'm just trying to get information, and
Are you good?
I'm not sure. I don't know what.
You want us to answer?
The motion today is that the money's being deposited into.
I get that. So it's then, okay. I'll talk to my 2 colleagues offline.
Perfect. Councillor Partridge.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And I don't know how being willing to share a third, and a third is being defensive, because I'm actually saying, yeah. Anyway, so the practice in the past has been, and it is a policy, that we do take the leftover slot money, and council passed it quite a few, 8 years ago, I think, Mike, and it goes into the Flamborough Reserve. Councillor Pursuta and I would share that equally. We would talk about different projects that were coming up, and 50% would go to Ward 15, 50% to Ward 14. And we did that over the years until the opportunity for the Greensville School and the Beverly School came on the horizon. And of course, the decision was to build new schools there. And so we sat down and we looked at, staff actually put together the finances of what money was needed. And he took a little bit more than 50%. I was okay with that because I didn't have anything pressing at the time in my ward. And I can't remember what we just finished spending it all on, but I know that Rob and I cleaned it right out in the last term of council. So what you see is what you get. Yeah, and it's always been the two of us working together hand in hand. And, you know, there was never any acrimony because I knew I had 50%, he knew he had 50%, and we would do that accordingly. When that school opportunity came up, of course, it was for much more money, and so there was an extra $200,000 that went to Councillor Pursuta, which I was perfectly fine with. Anyway, so we've worked together well over the many years now that he's not here. You know, I don't see that it needs to be any different. There's no reason for anybody to get defensive. I'm quite willing to share it, a third, a third, and a third. And I think, Mr. Chairman, that sounds good. Thank you.
Councillor Clark.
The other option is the TerraPure royalties that my two colleagues and I found out, I guess when I was appointed to the new Heritage Green Community Trust, we're re-examining the indenture, and the original C of A showed that it was for all of Stony Creek, and yet we had been spending, as council, it was always in Ward 9, it was not for all of Stony Creek. And so when I found that clause, I went to Councillor Pearson and Councillor Collins, because he now is a part of Stony Creek, and I said, I have to be honest, here's what I found. And so we sat down, and together we came up with the idea of sharing it 3 ways, but we did it, I think they called it a weighted by population. And it worked out fine, and it's a reasonable, explainable compromise that everyone understands, and now there's just 3 segregated funds that each councillor controls. So there are ways to get around it, and I'm such a nice guy, I gave lots of money away. I'm sorry you weren't around when I looked at it. It's not retroactive, is it, councillor?
No.
Okay. I have no further speakers then, and I have no further questions for Brian. We have 9.1 in front of us. I first need a motion to receive the presentation, moved by Ferguson, seconded by Vanderbeek. All those in favor? That carries, thank you. And I need an electronic vote to approve 9.1, moved by Wilson, seconded by Partridge. Evo, please. Carries, thank you. On to discussion items. 10.1 is a governance review subcommittee report. Moved by Pearson, seconded by Clark. Evo, please. And thank you very much. 10.2 is TerraPure Environmental Heritage Green Community Trust indenture. Councillor Clark on the report.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to deal with the conflict of interest issues. So I have 2 documents. One is from Principles Integrity that looks at the conflict of interest with regards to TerraPure and the environmental assessment. And that's clear. It's an apparent conflict of interest. I have another advice memorandum that deals strictly with the Heritage Green Community Trust, and it indicates that I do not have any conflict or interests, and that I can continue to serve on the Heritage Green Community Trust. This indenture that is before us for a decision actually came from the trustees with the Heritage Green Community Trust. If you look on the second page, I think it is the 3rd paragraph. It states, the current trustees of the Heritage Green Community Trust are seeking to amend and restate the existing trust indenture to update the names of and the contact information for the parties, because it had not been updated, to expand the definition of beneficial uses so that there's a broader opportunity to spread some of the compensation for which the compensation payments can be used, so to increase the scope of projects which could be funded by the trust. And we also ask that the number of community trustees be increased from 3 to 5. So it's relative housekeeping issues on it. I will be signing the indenture as a trustee, and I have no conflict based on the Integrity Commissioner's advice. So it's just a straightforward legal document that our staff dealt with. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Pearson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I have no problem with this moving forward. Just want to ask, as we are dealing with TerraPure right now, as you're aware of, with regards to their expansion, and I'm wondering, because I want to verify, so it's showing here tipping fee. This is the total amount that's paid. So out of this, money goes to the trust, and money goes to the community, to the councillors for what they wish. So if I could, through you to Cindy?
Through the chair, that's correct.
Okay, can I ask, because I think it would be valid and an important piece of information that we could have, and I know it'd probably take a bit of time to put together. Can we have a history of the amount of dollars that have been raised since we started generating revenue from the TerraPure, and how it's been split between the community trust and the city?
Through the chair, we can provide that information.
Could I, Mr. Chairman, through you, I'd just give it as direction if that's possible? I would really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. No further speakers then. On 10-2, moved by Councillor Clark, seconded by Councillor Pearson. Vote, please.
Yeah, no, you do. That's okay. I wasn't saying any secrets.
Carries. Thank you. 10-3 is the lead water service replacement loan program amendments. Questions or comments on that before I turn to a mover and a seconder? Councillor Wilson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to know whether we were able to identify those who have removed that section on their land, the private portion, whether we have an idea of where most of those occurrences take place.
In terms of the inventory of those homes?
Both those that have been replaced and where we think they exist at present. Thank you.
Andrew, you want to help us with that?
So through you, Mr. Chairman, we're still going through trying to validate our inventory, but I can tell you that predominantly we're typically find our lead services in our older subdivisions. So anything kind of pre-19 mid-50s is where we see our lead services. So that's where most of those replacements are occurring. So really mostly in the lower older city.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, to Andrew, the second part of the question is yes, so pre-1950 probably, I think it said in the report, and probably the lower city, but where primarily are the changes occurring in terms of their replacement? Thank you.
So how many, you have a ballpark?
So sorry, through you, Mr. Chairman, maybe just to clarify your question, are you asking in terms of who are accessing the loans or just in terms of who are replacing services in general?
Thank you. Thank you, through you, Mr. Chairman, to Andrew, both. I'm trying to get a sense of the profile of those who are accessing, and I'm trying to get a sense of where we're seeing the primary activity taking place, whether they're accessing or not.
So through you, Mr. Chairman, we're seeing predominantly a high volume in Ward 6. Also wards, obviously 5, 4, 3, and 2 are somewhat lower given their older stature, but Ward 6 is our highest uptake.
Thank you. Do we have a sense of the, what I'm trying to get at is the economic or the socioeconomic profile of those who are changing. And I was wondering if you were able to speak to that. Thank you.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, I don't know if I can speak with 100% certainty, but I think what you're getting at is certainly we do see some challenges perhaps in more Ward 2 and 3 where there are potentially lower income families. We don't see as much lead service line replacement in those areas, and when we do, they typically utilize the loan program that is in place.
Thank you. And are you able to, through you, Mr. Chairman Andrew, are you able to maybe provide, I know the report spoke to the importance of education and getting information out, but are you able to provide some sense of why maybe that in Ward 2 and 3, is it a financial issue? Is it a lack of awareness issue? You spoke about building inspectors making it part of their activity, but could you speak to that, please?
So through you, Mr. Chairman, one of the challenges we find in some of areas of Ward 2 and Ward 3 are that a lot of those properties are rental properties. So really it's incumbent upon the homeowner to take on the replacement, and there's really not as much an incentive for that homeowner. He's not receiving the benefit for it, so we don't often see them replacing their services as frequently as we do in other areas of the city.
All right, thank you.
Councillor Clark.
Yeah, I can just add something here for Councillor Wilson. The real challenge the municipality has is the Freedom of Information Act and Protection of Privacy Act. We can't ask for a lot of this information from individual residents because we're prohibited from gathering that information. You have to actually get the Privacy Commissioner involved to actually start doing any data crunching like that. And so we really can't, because it's come up a couple of times, I've heard from different councillors, we can't provide social economic background on our residents across it. We just don't have that data, and we're not in a position where we can ask for that data. So it's very challenging.
Okay, thanks, Councillor. I have no further speakers on 10.3. So I don't know if I went to a mover and seconder before, but I'm going to do it again. Moved by Ferguson, seconded by Partridge. All those in favor, e-vote, please. Thank you. And then on to 10.4, which is the subcommittee report. On that, oh, Councillor Clark.
So I'll be happy to move this, Mr. Chairman. I do want to thank all the councillors and the staff and our citizen members who sit on this committee. This is not a fun committee. It's very complex, comprehensive calculations and an awful lot of paperwork to go through, and we had some really, I would argue, very diligent citizen members serving on this committee this time, and I was very pleased with the questions that they were asking in just my short time. I didn't see that in my previous terms, and so I was very pleased with the work that committee did and got us to the point that we are. So I just wanted to thank everyone for their help and efforts in it.
Very good. Moved by Clark, seconded by Pearson on 10.4. E-vote, please. That carries, thank you. Any motions this afternoon? Any notices of motions this afternoon? Any general information or other business? And I'll turn to Mr. Zagaric, Cindy, and or Brian on that. Nothing more to add? Perfect. We have nothing private and confidential, and we're going to recess now until 7 o'clock this evening when we will entertain further delegations on the DC bylaw. We have 5. And then we'll open. We have Mr. Dean. We have Dr. Nafia Al-Mutawali. We have Stephanie Bertolo, Scott Robinson from McMaster Students Union. We have Savan Shandaria from T-Bro Group, and we have Karen Dearness. So those 5 are currently registered, and of course we will call to the audience again to see if there are others in attendance who'd like to speak. Councillor Partridge, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. And I just wanted to remind everyone that I will not be here this evening. It is my father's 98th birthday, and we will be celebrating.
And I can confirm that with the invitation that I received,
yes,
that I will be attending
invited.
tonight. So hopefully
yes,
someone else will be chairing this evening.